She had walked for 3 weeks with bleeding feet and an empty stomach. She had buried a husband and lost a child. She had been turned away from 17 doors, called a beggar, a burden, and worse. But when Eleanor Brooks finally collapsed at the iron gates of Highland Crest Ranch, she did not beg for mercy. She demanded honest work. What she could not know was that the man who owned those gates, the cold, silent widower Caleb Whitmore, was fighting his own war against grief. And sometimes, two broken people are exactly what each other needs. If you want to follow Eleanor's journey from rags to redemption, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and comment below with the city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The rain had stopped 3 days ago, but the mud still clung to everything. Eleanor Brooks pulled her shawl tighter against the October wind and kept walking. Her boots, what remained of them, squelched with each step. The leather split along both soles. The stitching rotted through weeks ago. She had stuffed newspaper inside them, somewhere outside of Cheyenne, but the paper had dissolved into gray pulp that now oozed between her toes with every painful stride. She did not stop. The road stretched ahead like a cruel promise, winding through golden hills dotted with cattle and fence posts that seemed to go on forever. Wyoming territory spread out around her in every direction, beautiful in a way that hurt, because beauty meant nothing when your stomach had forgotten what food felt like. 23 days. That was how long she had been walking. 23 days since she had left the boarding house in Denver with 11 cents in her pocket and a letter of recommendation that turned out to be worthless. 23 days since she had realized that a widow with no family, no skills beyond keeping house, and no references anyone would believe was worth less than the mud on these roads. 17 doors, 17 rejections. The words still echoed in her head, each one a stone dropped into the well of her dignity. We don't take in strays. Try the workhouse in Laramie. You look like trouble, ma'am. Best keep moving. My wife don't want your kind near our children. Your kind. As if poverty were a disease, as if grief were contagious. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She was 31 years old. She had been a wife for 8 years, a mother for 3. She had kept a home, managed accounts, nursed her husband through 2 winters of pneumonia before the 3rd one took him. She had buried her daughter with her own hands in a grave so small it broke something inside her that would never heal. She was not your kind. She was a woman who had survived, and she would keep surviving, even if it killed her. The gates appeared around the next bend, and Eleanor stopped walking for the first time in hours. Iron. Massive iron gates set between stone pillars that rose 10 feet high, each one topped with a carved eagle that seemed to stare down at her with cold judgment. Beyond the gates, a long drive lined with cottonwood trees led up to a house that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. Not a house. A mansion. 3 stories of gray stone and white trim, with a wraparound porch and windows that caught the afternoon light like dozens of watching eyes. Smoke curled from 2 of the 6 chimneys, and somewhere behind the main house, Eleanor could see the roofs of barns, stables, and what looked like a bunkhouse large enough to sleep 30 men. This was not a ranch, this was a kingdom. The sign on the gate confirmed it. Highland Crest Ranch, private property, no trespassing. Eleanor stood there for a long moment, her cracked lips pressed together, her hollow cheeks burning with something that might have been shame or might have been the last ember of her pride refusing to die. 18, she thought. This would be door number 18. She reached for the gate. Caleb Whitmore saw her coming up the drive from his study window, and his first thought was that she looked like death walking. Not dramatically, not poetically, just factually. The woman moved like someone who had forgotten that bodies needed rest, each step mechanical and determined in a way that suggested she would keep going until her legs simply stopped working. Her dress had once been blue, maybe, or gray. It was hard to tell under the layers of dust and mud and hard travel. Her hair was hidden under a bonnet that had seen better decades, and she carried nothing. No bag, no bundle, just herself, approaching his front door like she had every right to be there. Caleb turned from the window and checked his pocket watch. 3:40 in the afternoon. The hands had been in for lunch an hour ago, which meant no one was near the main house except Mrs. Patterson in the kitchen and the girls somewhere upstairs with their lessons. He should let Mrs. Patterson handle it. That was the protocol for vagrants. A meal, if they asked politely, and directions to town. Nothing more. Highland Crest was not a charity house, no matter how many hungry faces showed up at the gates each month. But something about this woman made Caleb walk downstairs himself. He opened the front door just as she reached the bottom of the porch steps. Up close, she looked worse. Her eyes, gray he noticed, the color of storm clouds, were sunk deep into a face that had once been pretty and was now carved down to bone and shadow. Her hands, gripping the edges of her shawl, were raw and red, the knuckles cracked open in places. She was thin in a way that spoke of weeks without proper food, and there was a tremor in her shoulders that might have been cold, or might have been exhaustion, or might have been the effort of staying upright. But she stood straight. That was what stopped him. She did not cower. She did not bow her head or twist her hands or offer the usual desperate smile of someone about to beg for scraps. She met his eyes directly, and her chin lifted. "Good afternoon," she said. Her voice was rough, cracked from disuse, but steady. "My name is Eleanor Brooks. I am looking for honest work. Not food, not shelter, not charity. Work." Caleb studied her in silence for a long moment. He was not a man who spoke when he had nothing to say, and right now he was trying to reconcile what his eyes were telling him with what his ears had just heard. "Mrs. Brooks," he said finally, his voice as flat and unrevealing as his expression. "You look like you haven't eaten in a week." 12 days, she corrected without flinching. "But I am not asking for a meal, Mr. Whitmore. Caleb Whitmore." "Mr. Whitmore." She inclined her head slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to be formal despite her appearance. "I am asking for employment. I can cook, clean, mend, keep accounts, manage a household. I am educated, sober, and willing to work hard. I am not asking for charity. I am asking for a chance to earn my keep." "You're asking to work in my house looking like that?" It was a cruel thing to say, and Caleb knew it as the words left his mouth. But he had learned a long time ago that cruelty was sometimes the fastest way to the truth. Eleanor Brooks did not look away. If anything, her jaw tightened further, and something flickered in those storm-gray eyes. Not hurt, but fire. "I am asking to work in your house despite looking like this," she said quietly, "because looking like this is not who I am. It is what happened to me. And what happens to a person is not the same as who they are." The wind picked up, sending a scatter of golden leaves across the porch. Somewhere behind the house, a horse nickered, and a man shouted something about a fence post. Caleb Whitmore stood in his doorway, looking at this ragged woman who should have been begging and was instead lecturing him about character, and felt something shift in his chest that he did not recognize. It had been a long time since anyone had surprised him. "Wait here," he said. He closed the door in her face. Eleanor stood on the porch for 7 minutes. She knew because she counted the seconds, an old habit from the years when time was the only thing she had in abundance. 7 minutes of standing in the cold, watching her breath fog in the air, wondering if she had just made a terrible mistake. She had not begged. That was the one thing she had promised herself back in Denver when everything fell apart. She would not beg. She would not grovel. She would offer what she had, her skills, her labor, her willingness to work until her hands bled. And if that was not enough, then she would move on to the next door. But there might not be a next door. She was out of road, out of towns, out of strength. Highland Crest Ranch was the last property for 20 miles in any direction, and she was not sure she could walk another 20 feet, let alone 20 miles. If he said no, the door opened. Caleb Whitmore stood there with a tin plate in one hand and a mug in the other. Steam rose from both. "Sit," he said, nodding toward a wooden chair near the railing. "Eat, then we'll talk." Eleanor hesitated for just a moment, pride warring with need before common sense won out. She sat. She took the plate, stew, thick with potatoes and carrots and chunks of beef that made her mouth water instantly, and the mug, coffee, hot and strong and bitter in the best possible way. She ate slowly, because she had learned the hard way that a starving stomach could not handle food too fast. Each bite was deliberate, careful, savored in a way that had nothing to do with taste and everything to do with survival. Caleb Whitmore leaned against the porch railing and watched her eat without speaking. He was tall, Over 6 feet, Eleanor guessed, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they had done real work despite the obvious wealth of his surroundings. His hair was dark brown, shot through with gray at the temples, and his face had the weathered quality of a man who spent more time outdoors than in parlors. He might have been 40 or 45 or somewhere in between. It was hard to tell with men like this, men who carried their age in their eyes rather than their faces. And his eyes were old and cold and guarded in a way that Eleanor recognized because she saw the same thing every time she looked in a mirror. This was a man who had lost something important. She finished the stew and set the plate aside carefully. "Thank you," she said. "That was generous." "That was practical," he corrected. "A woman who faints from hunger in my front yard is a problem I don't need." "I don't faint." "Everyone faints eventually, Mrs. Brooks. The body has limits." "So I've been told." She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug, letting the warmth seep into her cracked knuckles. "But I've also found that limits are often more flexible than people believe." Caleb studied her again with that unreadable expression. "Where are you from?" "Missouri originally, then Kansas, then Colorado, now here." "That's a lot of moving." "My husband was not a man who stayed in one place long." It was not quite a lie. Thomas had been restless, always chasing the next opportunity, the next investment, the next sure thing that never quite materialized. When he died, I found myself without a home or a place to go. "No family?" "None living." "No children?" Eleanor's hands tightened on the mug. This question, this was the one that always cut deepest. "I had a daughter. She died of scarlet fever 3 years ago. She was not yet 3 years old." The words came out flat, practiced, stripped of the raw grief that still lived in her chest. She had learned to say them that way because the alternative was to not say them at all, and she refused to pretend that Charlotte had never existed. Something flickered in Caleb Whitmore's eyes, something that might have been recognition or sympathy or the shadow of his own buried pain. "I'm sorry," he said. It was the first thing he had said that sounded genuine. "Thank you." Eleanor took a breath. "Now, about the work. I don't need a housekeeper. I have Mrs. Patterson." "I'm not asking to be a housekeeper. I'm asking to be useful in whatever capacity you require." "And if I don't require anything? Then I'll thank you for the meal and be on my way." She said it calmly, but they both knew it was a bluff. On her way to where? To what? There was nothing waiting for her out there except more roads, more rejections, more slow starvation until her body finally gave out. Caleb Whitmore pushed off from the railing and stood directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "I have 2 daughters," he said. "Martha is 9. Lucy is 5. Their mother left 2 years ago, ran off with a man from Chicago, and hasn't been seen since. The girls have not been the same since." Eleanor said nothing. She waited. "I have hired 6 governesses in 2 years. The longest one lasted 4 months. The shortest lasted 3 days. His jaw tightened. "My daughters are not easy children. They are hurt and angry, and they do not trust women. They have made it their mission to drive away anyone who tries to take their mother's place." "I am not trying to take anyone's place." "No, you're trying to survive. I understand that. But here's what I am offering, Mrs. Brooks." He crossed his arms over his chest. "I will give you food, shelter, and a bed in the servants' quarters. I will not give you wages. Not yet. What I will give you is a trial. 30 days to prove that you can be useful and that you can handle my daughters without running away or breaking down. And if I prove myself, then we discuss wages and permanent employment. And if I fail, then you leave with a letter of reference that might help you find work elsewhere." His eyes hardened. "But, Mrs. Brooks, if you hurt my children, if you lie to me, if you steal from this house or bring any kind of trouble to my doorstep, I will not be merciful. Do you understand?" Eleanor set down the coffee mug and rose to her feet. She was shorter than him by nearly a foot, but she did not feel small. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Whitmore. You are offering me a chance, not a guarantee. You are trusting me with your children, which is the most valuable thing you have, and you are warning me that trust, once broken, cannot be repaired." She held his gaze steadily. "I accept your terms." All of them. For a long moment, they stood there, two wounded people measuring each other across a gulf of mutual suspicion and desperate hope. Then Caleb Whitmore nodded once. "Mrs. Patterson will show you to your room. Dinner is at 6. You will meet the girls then." He turned toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "Mrs. Brooks." "Yes?" The last governess left in the middle of the night without saying goodbye. She told Mrs. Patterson that my daughters were little demons and that no amount of money was worth the torment. His voice was flat, but there was something underneath it, something that might have been pain or exhaustion or the weight of watching everyone give up. "Just so you know what you're walking into." Eleanor almost smiled. It was the first time in weeks that her lips had tried to curve upward. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly, "I have walked 3 weeks with no food and no hope. I have buried everyone I ever loved. I have been called a beggar, a burden, and worse things I will not repeat. Whatever your daughters can throw at me, I promise you I have survived worse." She meant it, and something in Caleb Whitmore's expression shifted just slightly, as if he almost believed her. The room was small, barely larger than a closet, really, but it had a bed with clean sheets, a washstand with actual soap, and a window that looked out over the eastern pastures. To Eleanor, who had spent the last 3 weeks sleeping in barns, ditches, and one particularly memorable night curled up inside an abandoned chicken coop, it looked like paradise. Mrs. Patterson had shown her upstairs with minimal conversation and maximum suspicion. The housekeeper was a stout woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair, sharp eyes, and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile sometime around the Civil War. "Mr. Whitmore told me to give you these," she had said, handing Eleanor a bundle of clothes, a plain gray dress, clean undergarments, and a pair of leather boots that actually fit. "Dinner's at 6. Don't be late. The girls eat in the main dining room with their father." "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson." The older woman had paused at the door, studying Eleanor with an expression that was impossible to read. The last girl who came here thought she could charm her way into the family, thought if she was pretty enough and sweet enough, Mr. Whitmore would marry her and she'd be mistress of all this. She gestured vaguely at the walls, the house, the vast property beyond. She learned different. "I have no interest in marrying anyone, Mrs. Patterson. I am here to work." The housekeeper's eyes narrowed. "We'll see." Now, alone in her tiny room, Eleanor stripped off her ruined clothes and used the wash basin to scrub 3 weeks of road dust from her skin. The water turned gray, then brown, then gray again as she worked, and by the time she was done, the basin looked like it had been used to wash farm equipment. She studied her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand and barely recognized the woman looking back at her. Thin. Too thin. Her collarbones jutted out like knives, and her cheeks had hollowed in a way that made her eyes look too large for her face. Her hair, once her vanity, hung in lank brown strands that desperately needed washing and probably cutting. There were new lines around her mouth and eyes, carved there by sun and wind and grief. She looked old. She was 31, but she looked 40. No matter. Looks were not what she had to offer. She dressed in the clean clothes Mrs. Patterson had provided. The gray dress was simple but well made, and the boots were heaven on her damaged feet, and spent the remaining time before dinner sitting by the window, watching the sun sink toward the western hills. Highland Crest Ranch spread out before her like a painting. Rolling pastures dotted with cattle, fences stretching to the horizon, barns and outbuildings clustered around the main house like chicks around a hen. Men on horseback moved in the distance, doing the endless work of keeping a place like this running. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney, carrying the smell of cooking meat and wood fire. It was beautiful, peaceful. A world away from the cramped boarding houses and dirty city streets Eleanor had known for the past year. And yet, there was something underneath the beauty, something she could feel but not quite name. A silence that was not quite peaceful, a stillness that felt more like holding one's breath than being at rest. This house was waiting for something, or maybe it was hiding from something. Eleanor did not know which, but she intended to find out. The dining room was designed to intimidate, and it succeeded. A long mahogany table that could seat 20 dominated the center of the room, surrounded by chairs with velvet cushions and carved backs. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, catching the lamplight and scattering it across walls papered in deep burgundy. A fireplace large enough to roast a pig crackled at one end, and above it hung a portrait of a woman so beautiful that Eleanor stopped in the doorway just to stare. Dark hair piled in elaborate curls, green eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you stood. A smile that was not quite kind, but was certainly triumphant. The woman in the portrait was dressed in silk and pearls, posed before a window with Highland Crest's pastures visible in the background. This had to be the wife, the one who had left. "That's our mother." Eleanor turned. A girl stood in the doorway on the opposite side of the room, 9 years old, according to her father, though she held herself with the stiff dignity of someone much older. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's cold eyes, and she was looking at Eleanor with an expression of pure, undisguised hostility. "You must be Martha," Eleanor said calmly. "I'm Mrs. Brooks." "I know who you are." The girl did not move from the doorway. "You're the new one. Father said you'd be eating with us." "That's right." "The last one ate with us, too, for a while." Martha's lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. Then Lucy put a spider in her soup, and she screamed so loud the horses spooked in the stable. Eleanor considered this information. That must have been quite a spider. It was a wolf spider. They're the biggest kind around here. Lucy collected it special. "I see." Eleanor walked slowly into the room, keeping her movements calm and unhurried. She had dealt with hostile children before, not often, but enough to know that fear was exactly what they wanted. "And where is Lucy now?" "Hiding under the table." Eleanor glanced at the massive dining table, then back at Martha. "Is she planning to put a spider in my soup?" "Maybe." The girl's hostile expression flickered, just slightly, as if she had not expected Eleanor to ask so directly. "Or maybe something worse." "Well?" Eleanor pulled out a chair, not at the head of the table where Caleb Whitmore would presumably sit, but 3 seats down, and settled into it with the air of someone who had every right to be there. "I suppose we'll find out together." She did not look under the table. She did not ask Lucy to come out. She simply sat there, hands folded in her lap, waiting. Martha stared at her for a long moment, clearly uncertain how to proceed. Then she crossed the room and took the seat directly across from Eleanor, her back very straight and her eyes very cold. "You won't last," she said quietly. "None of them do." "Perhaps," Eleanor agreed. "Or perhaps I'm different." "That's what they all say." "Do they?" Eleanor tilted her head. "What else do they say?" The question seemed to throw Martha off balance. She frowned, her dark brows drawing together. "What do you mean?" "I mean, when the other governesses, or whatever they were, came to this house, what did they say to you? How did they try to win you over?" For a moment Martha did not answer. Then, reluctantly, "They said they wanted to be our friend. They said they were there to help. They said—" Her voice turned bitter. "They said they would never leave us, that we could trust them. And then they left." "Yes." "Every single one." "Yes?" Eleanor nodded slowly. That must have been very painful. Something shifted in Martha's expression. A crack in the armor, quickly covered. "I don't need your pity. I'm not offering pity. I'm offering honesty." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her gray eyes meeting Martha's dark ones across the gleaming table. "I am not going to tell you that I want to be your friend because we don't know each other yet, and friendship has to be earned. I am not going to tell you that you can trust me because trust has to be proven, not promised. And I am certainly not going to tell you that I will never leave, because that is a promise no honest person can make." Martha's lips parted slightly. Whatever response she had prepared, this was not it. "What I will tell you," Eleanor continued, "is this. I am not here to replace your mother. I am not here to win your love or make you forget your pain. I am here because I need work, and your father offered me a trial. That is all. Whatever else happens, friendship, trust, respect, will have to be built over time, by actions, not words." Silence fell over the dining room. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the distance, a door opened and closed. Then, from beneath the table, a small voice said, "You talk funny." Eleanor did not look down. "Do I?" "Yes." A pause. "You don't sound scared." "That's because I'm not scared, Lucy." "Everyone's scared of us?" "I'm not everyone." Another pause, longer this time. Then a small face appeared at the edge of the table. Round cheeks, tangled brown hair, eyes that were the same storm gray as Eleanor's own. Lucy was 5 years old, according to her father, but she looked younger, fragile in a way that her older sister was not. In her hands she held a jar. Inside the jar, something large and hairy moved. "This is Herman," Lucy said solemnly. "He's my spider." Eleanor looked at the wolf spider, easily 3 inches across, with legs like jointed twigs and a body that seemed to pulse with malevolent life, and felt her skin crawl. She did not scream. She did not flinch. She did not look away. "Hello, Herman," she said calmly. "That's a very nice jar you have." Lucy's eyes went wide. "You're not scared?" "I'm not fond of spiders," Eleanor admitted. "But being not fond of something and being scared of it are different things." The last lady screamed. "I'm not the last lady." Lucy stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly she climbed out from under the table and took the seat next to her sister, still clutching Herman's jar. She did not put the spider anywhere near Eleanor's plate. She just sat there, studying Eleanor with an intensity that was almost unnerving. "Father says you walked here," she said finally, "for weeks and weeks." 3 weeks. "Why?" "Because I had nowhere else to go." "Where's your family?" Eleanor's chest tightened. "I don't have one anymore. They died." "All of them?" "All of them." Lucy considered this, then very quietly, "Our mother didn't die. She just left." Eleanor heard the words beneath the words, the confusion, the hurt, the terrible question that no 5-year-old should have to ask. Why wasn't I enough to make her stay? "I know," Eleanor said gently. "Your father told me." "She's not coming back," Martha said suddenly, her voice hard. "Everyone says she might, but she won't. She chose someone else instead of us." "Martha," Lucy began, "it's true. You know it's true." Martha's hands had curled into fists on the tabletop. "She didn't want us. She never wanted us. And anyone who says different is lying." The words hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor looked at these 2 wounded girls, one armored in anger, one drowning in confusion, and felt something shift in her chest. She knew this pain. She knew what it felt like to be left behind, to wonder what you had done wrong, to lie awake at night replaying every memory and searching for the moment when everything broke. She knew, and she could not fix it. No one could fix it. Some wounds did not heal. They just scarred over, becoming part of who you were. But she could do something else. Something smaller, but perhaps more important. She could stay. "Martha," she said quietly. "Lucy, I am not going to tell you that what your mother did was right. I am not going to explain it or excuse it or pretend it didn't happen. What I'm going to tell you is this. Her choice was about her, not about you. People leave because of who they are, not because of who you are." Lucy's lower lip trembled. Martha's face had gone very still. "I had a daughter," Eleanor continued, her voice steady despite the ache in her throat. "Her name was Charlotte. She was 2 years old when she died. I would have given anything to stay with her, but I couldn't. Sometimes people leave because they choose to, and sometimes people leave because they have no choice at all. But either way," she met both girls' eyes in turn, "either way, it is not your fault. It was never your fault." The dining room was very quiet. Then the door opened and Caleb Whitmore walked in. He paused just inside the threshold, taking in the scene. Eleanor in her borrowed gray dress, hands folded calmly on the table. Martha rigid with suppressed emotion, her dark eyes bright with something that might have been tears. Lucy clutching her spider jar, staring at Eleanor like she had just seen a ghost. "I see you've met," he said neutrally. "Yes," Eleanor replied. "We were just getting acquainted." "And?" Eleanor looked at the 2 girls, hostile, hurting, desperate for someone to prove that not everyone left. and then back at their father. "And I believe," she said quietly, "that we are going to get along just fine." She did not know if it was true. She did not know if she could keep that implicit promise, if she could survive whatever tests these wounded children would throw at her, if she could stay long enough to matter. But she knew she was going to try. For the first time in a very long time, Eleanor Brooks had something worth fighting for. Dinner was a quiet affair. Caleb Whitmore ate in near silence, speaking only to ask for the salt or to remind Lucy to use her napkin. The girls picked at their food with the distracted air of children whose minds were elsewhere, sneaking glances at Eleanor when they thought she wasn't looking. Eleanor ate slowly, savoring each bite of roast chicken and mashed potatoes and green beans cooked with bacon, more food than she had seen in weeks, prepared with a skill that spoke well of Mrs. Patterson's abilities. She did not try to make conversation. She did not attempt to charm or ingratiate. She simply ate and watched and listened. What she observed was troubling. Caleb Whitmore was not a cruel man. That much was clear. He did not raise his voice to his daughters, did not snap at them or criticize them, or treat them with the cold dismissiveness that some wealthy fathers showed their children, but neither did he connect with them. He looked at Martha and Lucy across the dinner table the way a man might look at a problem he had not yet solved. With concern, yes, but also with a kind of helpless distance. He did not know how to reach them. Perhaps he had never known. Or perhaps he had known once before his wife left and had forgotten in the wreckage that followed. Martha, for her part, seemed determined to pretend that Eleanor did not exist. She answered her father's occasional questions in monosyllables, kept her eyes fixed on her plate, and radiated hostility like a small, well-dressed furnace. Lucy was different. She kept stealing glances at Eleanor with those gray eyes so like her own, as if trying to reconcile the stranger at their table with the stories she had been told about previous governesses. Once, when Eleanor caught her looking, Lucy quickly dropped her gaze. But not before Eleanor saw the flicker of something that might have been curiosity or hope. When the meal was over and Mrs. Patterson had come to clear the plates, Caleb rose from his chair. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, his voice as flat as ever. "A word in my study, if you please." Eleanor followed him out of the dining room and down a long hallway lined with oil paintings and mounted hunting trophies. The study was at the far end, a large room dominated by a massive desk, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and windows that looked out over the darkening pastures. Caleb closed the door behind them and gestured to a leather chair facing the desk. Eleanor sat. He did not. Instead, he went to stand by the window, his back to her, his hands clasped behind him. "How did you do it?" he asked. "I beg your pardon?" "The girls. They did not scream at you, throw things at you, or try to run you off the property. That is the first time in 2 years that a new arrival has made it through dinner without some kind of incident." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "How did you do it?" Eleanor considered the question. "I didn't try to make them like me." "Explain." "Every other person who has come here, the governesses, the tutors, whoever, they all wanted your daughters to accept them. They wanted to be welcomed. They wanted to matter." She shook her head slowly. Children who have been abandoned can smell that desperation from a mile away. It reminds them of their own need, their own wanting, their own fear of being left behind again. It makes them feel unsafe. Caleb was watching her with an intensity that might have been unnerving if Eleanor had not already survived far worse. "So what did you do instead?" "I told them the truth. I told them that I was here because I needed work, not because I wanted to replace their mother. I told them that trust had to be earned, not promised. I told them—" She paused. "I told them about my daughter." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. "Your daughter who died." "Yes." "Why would you tell them that?" "Because they needed to know that I understand what it feels like to lose someone, that I am not going to pretend their pain doesn't exist or try to fix it with empty words and false cheer." Eleanor's voice was quiet but steady. "Those girls are not monsters, Mr. Whitmore. They are children who have been hurt very badly by someone who was supposed to love them. They are testing every adult who comes near them, waiting for the inevitable betrayal. The only way to pass that test is to refuse to play by its rules. Caleb was silent for a long moment. Then he walked to his desk, sat down heavily in the chair behind it, and ran a hand through his graying hair. He looked, Eleanor realized, exhausted. Not just physically tired, though that was evident in the shadows under his eyes and the lines around his mouth, but bone-deep weary in the way of a man who had been fighting a losing battle for far too long. "She didn't leave because of the girls," he said finally, his voice rough. "Margaret, my wife. Everyone thinks, they assume, He stopped, shook his head. "It wasn't about Martha and Lucy. It was about me." Eleanor said nothing. She simply waited. "I was not a good husband." The words seemed to cost him something. "I worked too much. I was away too often. I did not give her the attention she needed, the affection she craved. When she found it elsewhere," he spread his hands, "I cannot say I was surprised. Hurt, yes. Angry, but not surprised. And the girls? The girls blame themselves. Martha heard us arguing the night before Margaret left. Heard her say that this place was a prison, that the children were chains holding her down." His jaw tightened. "Martha has not forgiven her. I am not sure she ever will. And Lucy. Lucy was too young to understand. She just knows that her mother was there one day and gone the next, and no one can explain why in a way that makes sense." Eleanor thought of Charlotte, of the last time she had held her daughter, of the fever burning through that small body, of the moment when Charlotte's eyes had closed and simply not opened again. Why? She had asked that question 1,000 times in the months that followed. Why Charlotte? Why then? Why couldn't the doctors do more? Why couldn't prayer help? Why couldn't love be enough to keep someone alive? There was no answer. There never was. Some questions were not meant to be answered, only endured. "Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly, "I cannot fix what your wife broke. No one can. But I can promise you this. I will not lie to your daughters. I will not make promises I cannot keep. And I will not abandon them without warning, no matter how difficult things become. Even if they make your life miserable, even then." Why? The question was sharp, almost aggressive. What do you have to gain from staying? This trial offers you nothing certain, no wages, no security, no guarantee that it will lead anywhere. Why would you endure what my daughters will put you through for a chance that might amount to nothing? Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "Because I have nothing left to lose, Mr. Whitmore. Everything I loved is gone. Everything I built has been destroyed. I am 31 years old, and I have buried my husband, my child, and every hope I ever had for the future. What your daughters can do to me, what anyone can do to me, cannot possibly hurt worse than what I have already survived." She rose from her chair, smoothing her borrowed gray dress with hands that did not tremble. "I am not staying because I hope to win something. I am staying because I have finally reached a place where I can stop running. Whether that place becomes a home or just another way station," she shrugged, "that depends on more than just me. But I will give it everything I have. That is the only promise I can make." Caleb Whitmore stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. 30 days, Mrs. Brooks. We will see what you are made of." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "We will." She turned and walked out of the study, closing the door quietly behind her. That night, Eleanor lay in her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her. Wind rattling the windows, the distant lowing of cattle. Footsteps somewhere overhead, Mrs. Patterson making her evening rounds perhaps, or Caleb Whitmore pacing in his study. She was warm. She was fed. She was clean for the first time in weeks, and yet sleep would not come. Her mind kept returning to the dining room, to Martha's hostility and Lucy's fragile hope and Caleb's exhausted desperation, to the portrait of the beautiful woman who had chosen freedom over family and the wreckage she had left behind. This house was broken. These people were broken. And Eleanor was broken too. But broken things could be mended, not made new, not returned to what they had been before, but patched and reinforced and made functional again. She had learned that lesson in the years since Charlotte's death. in the slow, painful process of rebuilding a life from the rubble of grief. Maybe that was why she was here. Not because she deserved to be saved, but because she understood what it meant to need saving. Not because she had answers, but because she knew what it was like to live without them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Martha would test her, Lucy would watch her, Caleb would judge her, Mrs. Patterson would doubt her. The whole ranch would wonder what this ragged stranger was doing in their midst. But for tonight, for this one quiet night, Eleanor Brooks was exactly where she needed to be. She closed her eyes and slept without dreams. And outside her window, the vast Wyoming sky blazed with stars that had watched over this land for 1,000 years, indifferent to the small struggles of the humans below, but beautiful, achingly beautiful, in a way that Eleanor would learn to love. The first week passed in a blur of small battles and smaller victories. Eleanor rose each morning before dawn, dressing in the darkness of her tiny room and making her way to the kitchen before Mrs. Patterson had finished stoking the fires. She did not ask for permission. She simply appeared, sleeves rolled to her elbows, ready to work. "I didn't ask for help," Mrs. Patterson said on the second morning, her voice sharp with suspicion. "No," Eleanor agreed, already reaching for the flour bin. "But you have it anyway." The housekeeper watched her knead bread dough with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. "Where did you learn to do that?" "My mother was a baker's daughter. She taught me before I was old enough to reach the counter without a stool." Mrs. Patterson said nothing, but she did not send Eleanor away. By the end of the week, they had fallen into an unspoken rhythm, Eleanor handling the morning bread and breakfast preparations while the older woman focused on the heavier cleaning and the endless laundry that a household this size generated. It was not friendship, it was not even warmth, but it was something, and Eleanor had learned long ago to be grateful for something. The girls were another matter entirely. Martha maintained her wall of hostile silence, answering Eleanor's questions in monosyllables when she answered at all. She took her lessons in the schoolroom on the second floor with the same rigid posture and cold eyes she had shown at dinner that first night, completing her assignments with mechanical precision and offering nothing beyond what was strictly required. Eleanor did not push. She assigned readings and arithmetic problems, checked Martha's work with careful attention, and offered corrections without criticism. When Martha slammed her books closed at the end of each session and stalked from the room without a word, Eleanor simply noted the assignments for tomorrow and let her go. Lucy was different. Where her sister had built walls, Lucy had dug tunnels. She watched Eleanor constantly, appearing in doorways and around corners, her gray eyes tracking every movement with an intensity that was almost unnerving. She did not speak much, but she listened to everything, and Eleanor often caught her lurking outside the kitchen door, while Eleanor and Mrs. Patterson worked, or sitting on the stairs while Eleanor swept the front hall. On the fourth day, Lucy approached her directly for the first time since the spider incident at dinner. "Mrs. Brooks?" Eleanor looked up from the potatoes she was peeling to find Lucy standing in the kitchen doorway, Herman's jar clutched against her chest like a talisman. "Yes, Lucy?" "Herman is sick." Eleanor set down her knife and wiped her hands on her apron. "What makes you think so?" "He won't eat. I gave him a fly yesterday and he just sat there. He's never done that before." The distress in the child's voice was genuine. This was not a test or a trap, but a real problem that needed solving. Eleanor crossed to where Lucy stood and crouched down to examine the jar more closely. The wolf spider inside did look sluggish, his movements slow and uncertain in a way that even Eleanor's untrained eye could recognize as wrong. "How long have you had Herman?" "Since summer. I found him in the barn." "And he's been eating well until now?" Lucy nodded, her lower lip trembling slightly. "Do you think he's dying?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. She knew almost nothing about spiders, but she knew quite a lot about children who had already lost too much. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I know someone who might. Do you know if any of the ranch hands are good with animals? Not just horses and cattle, but smaller creatures?" Lucy thought about this. "Old Pete knows about everything. He's been here since before Father was born. He says he's seen every kind of creature in Wyoming." "Then perhaps we should ask old Pete." Lucy stared at her. "You'd come with me?" "If you want me to." For a long moment, the child said nothing, then very quietly, "The other ladies never wanted to touch Herman. They said he was disgusting. Hermann is not my favorite creature, Eleanor said honestly. But he's important to you, and that makes him important enough to help. Shall we go find old Pete? Lucy's eyes went wide. Then, before Eleanor could react, the child grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the back door. Old Pete turned out to be a weathered man in his 70s with a face like cracked leather and hands that had clearly spent decades working rope and leather. He was sitting on an overturned bucket outside the main barn, whittling something that might have been a horse or might have been a dog, when Lucy came running up with Eleanor in tow. Pete! Pete! Herman is sick! The old man looked up, his eyes crinkling with something like affection. That's so, little miss. Let's have a look. He examined the spider with surprising gentleness, tilting the jar this way and that in the autumn sunlight. Ah, he said finally, I see the problem. Your Herman ain't sick, Lucy. He's getting ready to molt. Molt? Shed his skin. Spiders do it as they grow, crawl right out of their old outsides and leave 'em behind like an empty coat. Pete handed the jar back to Lucy. He'll be sluggish for a few days, won't want to eat. But once he's done, he'll come out bigger and hungrier than ever. Just give him time. Lucy's face transformed with relief. He's not dying. Not hardly, just growing up. Thank you, Pete. Lucy hugged the jar to her chest, then did something that clearly startled her as much as it did Eleanor. She turned and hugged Eleanor too, quick and fierce, before running back toward the house with Herman bouncing in her arms. Old Pete watched her go with a knowing look. That's the first time I've seen her take to someone new since her mama left. She's a sweet child. She is. Scared, though. Scared of losing anyone else. Pete turned his weathered gaze on Eleanor. You the new governess? I'm not sure what I am yet. I'm on a trial. He went back to his whittling. Well, Mrs. Brooks, if you can make that little one smile like that, I'd say you're off to a good start. Eleanor walked back to the house slowly, thinking about what had just happened. It had been such a small thing, a sick spider, a worried child, a simple solution, and yet it felt significant in a way she could not quite articulate. She had not tried to win Lucy over. She had simply paid attention. She had taken the child's concerns seriously, offered practical help, and followed through without making it into something larger than it was. Maybe that was the secret. Not grand gestures or declarations of affection, but small acts of reliability, repeated over time. Showing up, following through, being exactly who you said you were. It was not a complicated formula, but Eleanor suspected it was more than anyone had offered these girls in a very long time. The second week brought the first real crisis. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon during what should have been a routine arithmetic lesson. Martha was working through a set of long division problems at her desk by the window, her pen scratching against the paper with mechanical regularity. Lucy was practicing her letters at the smaller table nearby, her tongue poking out in concentration as she formed each careful stroke. Eleanor was reviewing Martha's previous day's work when she heard it. A sharp intake of breath from the older girl, followed by silence. She looked up to find Martha frozen at her desk, staring at something outside the window. Her face had gone white. Martha? What is it? The girl did not answer. She simply sat there, rigid as a statue, her pen still clutched in her trembling hand. Eleanor rose and crossed to the window. At first she saw nothing unusual, just the front drive, the cottonwood trees, the iron gates in the distance. Then a carriage appeared around the bend in the road, and she understood. It was an elegant carriage, painted deep blue with gold trim, pulled by a matched pair of black horses. The kind of carriage that belonged to someone wealthy, someone important, someone who did not belong on a working ranch in the middle of Wyoming territory. Lucy, Eleanor said quietly, please go to your room for a little while. Lucy looked up, confused. But I haven't finished my letters. You can finish them later. Go now, please. Something in Eleanor's voice must have communicated the seriousness of the moment, because Lucy set down her pen and slipped out of the room without further argument. Eleanor heard her footsteps on the stairs, then the distant sound of a door closing. Martha had not moved. She was still staring at the carriage as it rolled up the drive and stopped in front of the main house. Martha, Eleanor said gently, who is in that carriage? The girl's voice came out flat. Dead. That's my grandmother. My mother's mother. A door opened and closed somewhere below. Voices echoed in the entrance hall, Caleb Whitmore's deep tones, sharp with something that might have been anger or might have been fear, and a woman's voice, cultured and cold, cutting through his words like a knife through butter. I have every right to see my granddaughters, Caleb. You cannot keep them from me forever. I can and I will, Helen. You are not welcome in this house. The law disagrees. I have a letter from my lawyer. Martha's pen snapped in her hand. Eleanor turned to find the girl staring at the broken pieces, blood welling from a cut on her palm where the splintered wood had pierced her skin. She seemed not to notice. Martha. Eleanor crouched beside the desk and carefully took the girl's injured hand in her own. Let me see. She wants to take us. Martha's voice was still flat, but her hand was shaking. She's been trying since Mother left. She says Father is unfit. She says we need a proper home, a proper education, a proper mother figure. And what do you say? For the first time since the carriage appeared, Martha looked directly at Eleanor. Her dark eyes were blazing with a fury that seemed too large for her 9-year-old frame. She's a liar. She never cared about us before. She never visited, never wrote, never sent birthday gifts or Christmas presents. She only wants us now because it would hurt Father, because taking us away is the only way she can punish him for not making Mother happy. Eleanor processed this information quickly. A custody battle. A vindictive grandmother. A father who was clearly struggling to hold his family together. No wonder Caleb Whitmore kept such careful watch over his daughters. No wonder he tested every person who came near them. The voices from downstairs were getting louder. You cannot simply show up unannounced and demand, I can and I have, Caleb. And unless you want this to become even more unpleasant, you will let me see Martha and Lucy. Now. Eleanor made a decision. Martha, stay here. Do not come downstairs unless your father calls for you. Do you understand? The girl's eyes widened. What are you going to do? I'm going to buy your father some time. Now stay here and do not let your sister out of her room. Before Martha could respond, Eleanor was out the door and moving down the hallway. She descended the main staircase with unhurried steps, her borrowed gray dress brushing against her ankles, her expression carefully neutral. The entrance hall was exactly as tense as it had sounded from above. Caleb Whitmore stood with his back to the stairs, his shoulders rigid with barely controlled rage. Facing him was a woman in her late 50s, dressed in a traveling suit of deep green velvet that must have cost more than Eleanor had earned in a year of honest work. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, polished, preserved, utterly artificial. Behind her stood a man in a dark suit, holding a leather case that almost certainly contained legal documents. Ah, the woman said, catching sight of Eleanor on the stairs. Her eyes swept over the plain gray dress, the practical boots, the face that still bore the marks of recent hardship. And who is this? Another one of your servants, Caleb? Mrs. Brooks is my daughter's companion, Caleb said, not turning around. Eleanor, please return upstairs. Of course, Mr. Whitmore. Eleanor continued down the stairs until she stood at the bottom, directly between Caleb and the entrance hall. But first, I wonder if I might ask our visitor a question. The woman, Helen, Caleb had called her, raised one perfectly shaped eyebrow. I beg your pardon? You said you have every right to see your granddaughters. I'm curious what rights exactly you believe those to be. Helen's eyes narrowed. I don't see how that's any concern of yours. It's very much my concern, ma'am. I am responsible for Martha and Lucy's welfare during the day. Any disruption to their routine affects my work. Caleb had turned now, staring at Eleanor with an expression she could not read. Warning? Surprise? Something else entirely? The law is quite clear, the man with the leather case interjected. Mrs. Ashworth has the right to petition for visitation and potentially custody of her grandchildren. Mr. Whitmore's refusal to cooperate will only strengthen her case. I see. Eleanor folded her hands in front of her. And the law is also quite clear, I believe, about the weight given to the children's own wishes in custody matters, particularly when those children are old enough to express a preference. The lawyer's face flickered with something like uncertainty. That's a factor, yes, among many. Then perhaps, Eleanor said calmly, before anyone files any petitions or makes any legal threats, someone should ask Martha and Lucy what they actually want. Helen Ashworth's beautiful face hardened. Children don't know what they want. They need guidance from adults who have their best interests at heart. With respect, ma'am, you have not seen your granddaughters in over 2 years. How can you know what their best interests are if you don't know who they are? The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Caleb stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Eleanor in a way that might have been protective or might have been strategic. Mrs. Ashworth, this is neither the time nor the place for this discussion. If you wish to pursue legal channels, you are welcome to do so, but I will not allow you to upset my daughters with an unannounced visit and veiled threats. Veiled? Helen laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. There is nothing veiled about my intentions, Caleb. You drove my daughter away with your coldness and your neglect. You are doing the same thing to her children. And I will not stand by and watch those girls suffer the way Margaret suffered. Margaret left because she chose to leave. That is not my failing, and it is certainly not the girls' failing. Now, please. Caleb's voice dropped, becoming something almost dangerous. Leave my property before I have you removed. For a long moment, Helen Ashworth stood her ground. Then she smiled, a cold, thin smile that did not reach her eyes. Very well. For now. She turned toward the door, then paused. But this is not over, Caleb. I promise you that. She swept out, her lawyer trailing behind her like a well-dressed shadow. The door closed. The sound of the carriage wheels crunching on gravel faded slowly into the distance. Caleb stood motionless until the sound was gone completely. Then he turned to Eleanor. What the hell was that? Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. That was me buying you approximately 30 seconds to think instead of react. I didn't ask you to intervene. No, you didn't. You could have made things worse. You could have given her ammunition to use against me in court. Perhaps, but I didn't. Eleanor's voice was steady. I simply reminded her that the children are people with their own opinions, not prizes to be won. If her case depends on pretending that Martha and Lucy are helpless victims who need rescuing, that reminder might make her reconsider her approach. Caleb stared at her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a short, harsh sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. You're either very brave or very foolish, Mrs. Brooks. I have been called both at various times. Which do you think you are? Eleanor considered the question. I think I am a woman who has nothing left to lose, which makes questions of bravery and foolishness somewhat irrelevant. I act because action is required, not because I have calculated the risks. Caleb's expression shifted, becoming something more complex than simple anger or surprise. The girls, he said quietly, are they all right? Martha was upset. She cut her hand on a broken pen. Lucy is in her room. I sent her there before she could see the carriage. Thank you. It was the first time he had thanked her for anything since she arrived. You're welcome, Mr. Whitmore. Eleanor turned toward the stairs. With your permission, I should check on them. Mrs. Brooks. She paused, one hand on the banister. That woman, Helen Ashworth, she is not wrong about everything. Caleb's voice was rough. I was not a good husband. I was distant, absorbed in my work, unwilling to give Margaret the attention she needed. When she left, he trailed off, then forced himself to continue. When she left, I told myself it was her fault, her weakness, her selfishness. But the truth is more complicated than that. Eleanor waited. I failed her, he said, and I am failing my daughters. I see them hurting, and I don't know how to help. I try to protect them, and I only make them feel more trapped. He shook his head. I don't know how to be what they need. It was the most honest thing he had said to her since they met. Eleanor turned fully to face him. Mr. Whitmore, I am not qualified to judge your marriage or your parenting, but I can tell you this. Martha and Lucy do not need you to be perfect. They need you to be present. They need to know that when they look for you, you will be there. That when they speak, you will listen. That when they are afraid, you will not dismiss their fear. And if I don't know how to do those things, then you learn. The same way you learn to run this ranch, to manage your business, to survive your wife's departure. You pay attention. You make mistakes. You try again. She held his gaze. It is not about being perfect, Mr. Whitmore. It is about being willing to try. Caleb was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded, once. Go to the girls, Mrs. Brooks. I need to speak with my lawyer. Eleanor climbed the stairs without looking back. She found Martha in the schoolroom exactly where she had left her, sitting at her desk with her injured hand wrapped in a handkerchief that was slowly turning red. Lucy was there too, perched on the edge of her sister's chair, with her arms wrapped around Martha's shoulders. Is she gone? Martha asked. She's gone. Is she coming back? Probably, but not today. Eleanor crossed to the desk and gently took Martha's hand. Let me see this. We should clean it properly. Martha allowed her to unwrap the handkerchief. The cut was not deep, but it was messy, and it had clearly been bleeding for some time. Lucy, would you please fetch the medical kit from Mrs. Patterson? It should be in the kitchen cabinet near the stove. Lucy nodded and ran off, leaving Eleanor alone with Martha for the first time since the crisis began. You stood up to her, Martha said quietly. My grandmother. I heard you from the top of the stairs. I simply asked her a few questions. No one ever asks her questions. People are afraid of her. She's rich and powerful, and she knows everyone important in Chicago. Eleanor cleaned the cut with water from the washstand, her movements gentle but efficient. Being rich and powerful does not make someone right, Martha. It only makes them loud. Martha was quiet for a moment, then, do you think she can really take us away? Eleanor considered how to answer. The truth was, she did not know. Custody battles were complicated, influenced by money and connections as much as by the welfare of the children involved. Helen Ashworth clearly had both money and connections in abundance. But Martha did not need uncertainty right now. She needed something to hold on to. I think, Eleanor said carefully, that your father loves you very much. I think he will fight for you with everything he has. And I think that any judge who speaks to you and Lucy for 5 minutes will see that you are not neglected children who need rescuing, but strong, intelligent girls who know exactly where they belong. Martha's dark eyes searched Eleanor's face, looking for the lie, the empty reassurance, the false promise. She did not find one. You're different, she said finally, from the others. I know. Why? Eleanor finished bandaging Martha's hand and sat back. Because I am not trying to make you love me, Martha. I'm not trying to replace your mother or fix your family or make everything better with smiles and kind words. I'm simply trying to be someone you can rely on, someone who shows up, does her job, and does not disappear when things get difficult. How do I know you won't disappear? You don't, not yet. But every day that I am still here, every morning that I show up for lessons, every time something hard happens, and I stay instead of running, that is how you will know. Not through promises, but through proof. Martha looked down at her bandaged hand. When she looked up again, something in her expression had shifted, not softened exactly, but opened, just a crack. I still don't like you, she said. That's fair. But I don't hate you anymore. That's progress. For the first time since Eleanor had arrived at Highland Crest Ranch, Martha almost smiled. The 3rd week brought the first frost. Eleanor woke one morning to find the world transformed, every surface coated in delicate white crystals, the pastures sparkling in the early light like fields scattered with diamonds. Her breath fogged in the cold air of her tiny room, and she dressed quickly, layering her warmest clothes and wrapping her shawl tight around her shoulders. Downstairs, Mrs. Patterson was already building up the fires, muttering about the early cold and the extra wood that would need to be brought in from the shed. Can I help? Eleanor asked. The older woman glanced at her, and something in her face had changed over the past weeks. Not quite warmth, but an absence of the hostility that had been there before. You can take breakfast up to the girls. I'll manage the fires. It was the first time Mrs. Patterson had asked Eleanor to serve the children directly, rather than simply helping in the kitchen. A small thing, but significant. Eleanor prepared a tray with hot oatmeal, fresh bread, and 2 cups of warm milk, then carried it carefully up the stairs to the nursery where the girls took their breakfast. She found them both at the window, still in their nightgowns, staring out at the frosted world with matching expressions of wonder. "It's so beautiful," Lucy breathed. "Look at how everything sparkles." "It's just frost," Martha said, but her voice lacked its usual hard edge. "It happens every year. But it's still beautiful. Even if it happens every year, it's still beautiful every time." Lucy turned to see Eleanor in the doorway. "Mrs. Brooks, come look." Eleanor set down the tray and crossed to join them at the window. From up here, the view was even more stunning. Miles of frosted pastures rolling toward distant mountains that were already capped with snow, the whole landscape glittering under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. "It is beautiful," she agreed. "In Missouri, where I grew up, we used to say that the first frost was winter knocking on the door." "What did you say back?" Lucy asked. "We said, 'Not yet, please, we're not ready.' But winter never listened. It always came anyway." Lucy giggled. Martha almost smiled. "Eat your breakfast before it gets cold," Eleanor said, "and then we have lessons." "Can we have lessons outside today?" Lucy asked eagerly. "Just this once. We could study the frost. You could teach us about how it forms and why it sparkles and—" "That's a childish idea," Martha interrupted. "Lessons are for the schoolroom." But Eleanor was already thinking. "Actually, Lucy, that's not a bad suggestion. There's quite a lot of science in frost formation. Crystalline structures, temperature differentials, the behavior of water molecules. We could make it an educational expedition." Martha stared at her. "You're serious?" "I'm always serious about learning. The best lessons happen when students are engaged with their subject matter." Eleanor tilted her head. "Unless you'd rather stay inside and do long division?" The question hung in the air for just a moment. Then Martha shrugged, trying to look indifferent. "I suppose an outdoor lesson wouldn't be entirely pointless." An hour later, the three of them were bundled in warm coats and sturdy boots, exploring the frosted gardens behind the main house. Eleanor explained the science of frost formation, while Lucy collected samples of particularly beautiful ice crystals, and Martha took notes in a small leather journal she had produced from somewhere in her room. It was the first time the three of them had done anything together that was not strictly required. The first time the girls had chosen to spend time with Eleanor rather than simply enduring her presence. Small victories, Eleanor thought, one after another. They were examining a spider web that had been transformed into a lace of ice crystals when they heard the shouting. It came from the direction of the barns, men's voices, urgent and angry, mixing with the sound of a horse in distress. Eleanor straightened immediately, her body tensing with the instinct that trouble was coming. "Girls, go inside, now!" "But what's happening?" Lucy asked. "I don't know. That's why you're going inside while I find out. Go to Mrs. Patterson and stay with her until I come for you." For once, neither girl argued. They ran for the house, Martha pulling Lucy along by the hand, while Eleanor picked up her skirts and hurried toward the source of the commotion. She found a crowd gathered outside the main barn. Ranch hands, stable boys, and at the center of the chaos, Caleb Whitmore himself, his face white with fury. "Who let him out?" Caleb was demanding. "Who opened that gate?" "Sir, we don't know," one of the hands was saying. "We came in this morning and the gate was already open. Storm must have smelled the mares because he went straight for the breeding paddock." "Storm is not supposed to be anywhere near the breeding paddock. He's wild, he's dangerous, and he could have killed someone." Caleb ran a hand through his hair. "Where is he now?" "Pete's got him cornered in the south pasture, but it took 4 men to get him there. He kicked Jim in the shoulder, might be broken." Eleanor approached cautiously, not wanting to interrupt but needing to understand what was happening. One of the younger hands noticed her and touched his hat. "Ma'am, you shouldn't be here. Storm's a killer when he's riled up." "Storm?" "Mr. Whitmore's stallion. Wild Mustang he captured 3 years ago. Never been broken, never been tamed. Mr. Whitmore keeps trying, but that horse won't let anyone near him." Eleanor looked toward the south pasture, where she could just make out a knot of men on horseback surrounding something, a dark shape that was rearing and plunging and screaming with rage. "If he can't be tamed, why keep him?" The hand shrugged. "Mr. Whitmore says he sees something in that horse, potential or some such. But if you ask me, some creatures are just born wild and stay that way. No amount of patience or kindness is going to change their nature." Eleanor watched the distant struggle for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, her mind working through what she had just witnessed. A wild stallion. A man who refused to give up on him. A pattern of behavior that suggested more about Caleb Whitmore than he probably realized. Some creatures are just born wild. No amount of patience or kindness is going to change their nature. Or maybe some creatures were born wild, and the kindness they needed was not the kind that tried to change them, but the kind that let them be what they were while slowly earning their trust. Maybe the same was true of wounded children. Maybe the same was true of wounded men. That evening, after the girls were in bed and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Eleanor sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and tried to make sense of everything that had happened since she arrived at Highland Crest Ranch. 3 weeks. She had been here 3 weeks. In that time, she had earned something like acceptance from Mrs. Patterson, something like curiosity from Lucy, and something like grudging respect from Martha. She had stood up to a wealthy matriarch, helped calm a crisis, and turned a frost-covered morning into a lesson that both girls had actually enjoyed. She had also learned more about Caleb Whitmore than he had probably intended to reveal. His guilt over his failed marriage, his fear of losing his daughters, his determination to tame a horse that everyone else had given up on, because he saw something in that wild creature that no one else could see. He was not a bad man. He was a lonely man, a grieving man, a man who had built walls around his heart so thick that even his own children couldn't get through. Eleanor understood that. She had her own walls. The kitchen door opened and Caleb himself walked in. He stopped when he saw her, clearly not expecting anyone to be awake at this hour. His shirt was untucked, his hair disheveled, and there was a weariness in his face that went beyond simple exhaustion. "Mrs. Brooks, I thought everyone was asleep. I couldn't settle. Too much on my mind." She gestured to the pot on the stove. "There's tea, if you want it." He hesitated for a moment, then crossed to pour himself a cup. He didn't sit at the table. Instead, he leaned against the counter, cradling the warm cup in his hands like a man seeking comfort from any source he could find. "I heard about the horse," Eleanor said. "Is your man all right, the one who was kicked?" "Jim will heal. Broken collarbone, but nothing worse." Caleb took a long drink of tea. "I should have put that horse down 3 years ago. Everyone said so, but I couldn't." "Why not?" "Because..." He trailed off, staring into his cup. "Because when I first saw him, running wild across the plains with his herd, he was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Pure freedom, pure fire. I thought if I could just earn his trust, if I could just show him that not all humans were enemies." He shook his head. 3 years later, and he still tries to kill anyone who gets close. Maybe he's not ready to trust yet. Maybe he never will be. Maybe. But you're still trying. Caleb looked at her then, really looked, in a way he had not since that first day on the porch. "Why do you care, Mrs. Brooks? About a horse you've never met?" "I care because I understand him." Eleanor set down her teacup. "I spent 3 weeks walking across this territory with nothing but the clothes on my back and the grief in my heart. Every person who looked at me saw something to be feared or pitied or dismissed. No one saw me. They saw a problem to be solved, a burden to be passed along, a creature that had outlived its usefulness." She held his gaze steadily. "When I arrived at your gates, I expected the same treatment. Another rejection. Another door closed in my face. But you looked at me and saw something else. Not charity, not pity. A chance. You gave me a chance to prove what I was worth. And that chance..." Her voice caught slightly. "That chance saved my life. Not because I was starving, though I was, but because it reminded me that I still had something to offer. That I was not just a burden to be endured, but a person with skills and dignity and value." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. "Storm is not just a horse to you," Eleanor continued softly. "He's proof that you haven't given up. On wildness, on freedom, on the possibility that broken things can be made whole again. If you tamed him, it would mean something. It would mean that all the patience, all the hope, all the refusal to surrender, it would mean that was worth something." Caleb was staring at her with an expression she could not read. "And if I can't tame him?" If he stays wild forever, no matter what I do? Then you will have tried. And trying, continuing to try when everyone else has given up, that means something too. Eleanor rose from her chair. Good night, Mr. Whitmore. Thank you for the tea. She was halfway to the door when his voice stopped her. Eleanor. She turned. It was the first time he had used her first name. You're not like anyone I've ever met. I know. She almost smiled. Good night, Caleb. She walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs to her small room, and behind her Caleb Whitmore sat alone in the dying firelight, thinking thoughts he had not allowed himself to think in a very long time. The fourth week began with rain. It came in from the west in great gray sheets, drumming against the windows and turning the ranch roads into rivers of mud. The hands grumbled about the weather, the cattle huddled together in the pastures, and the entire household seemed to contract inward, seeking warmth and shelter from the relentless downpour. For Eleanor, the rain brought an unexpected gift: time. With outdoor work impossible and the roads impassable, the normal rhythms of ranch life slowed to a crawl. Lessons lasted longer. Meals became more leisurely. And for the first time since she arrived, Eleanor had hours to fill that were not already claimed by work or study. She spent them with the girls. Not in the schoolroom with its formal desks and blackboard and sense of obligation, but in the library, a warm, wood-paneled room lined with more books than Eleanor had seen in years. They read aloud to each other, taking turns with chapters of adventure novels and collections of poetry. They played cards at a table by the fire. They told stories, real ones, about their lives, their fears, their memories. Lucy talked about her mother. Not the leaving, she was still too young to fully understand that, but the before. The way Margaret used to smell like roses, the songs she would sing at bedtime, the feeling of being held, safe and warm, in arms that no longer reached for her. Martha talked about her father, about how different he had been before, how he used to laugh and play and carry her on his shoulders across the pastures, about watching him close himself off, piece by piece, as the marriage crumbled, about the night her mother left, when she had heard him crying in his study and been too afraid to go to him. Eleanor talked about Charlotte. She had not meant to. She had kept that wound closed for so long, wrapped in layers of survival and forward motion, that she had almost forgotten it was there. But something about these two damaged girls, with their own motherless grief, made her want to share it. So she told them. About the pregnancy, difficult but joyful. About the birth, long and painful but worth every moment when she finally held her daughter. About 2.5 years of wondering and delight, watching this small person grow and change and become herself. And then the fever, the long nights, the doctors who could do nothing, the morning when Charlotte did not wake up. I buried her myself, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the tears running down her cheeks. Thomas was too drunk to help, and there was no one else. I dug the grave in our backyard, beneath the apple tree where she used to play. I wrapped her in her favorite blanket, and I sang to her one last time, and I put her in the ground. Lucy was crying openly, pressed against Eleanor's side with her face buried in Eleanor's sleeve. Martha sat very still, her dark eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. How did you survive? Martha asked. After. How did you keep going? Eleanor thought about the question carefully. I almost didn't. For a long time I wanted to stop, to close my eyes and not open them again. But then I realized something. What? Charlotte loved me. She trusted me completely the way only a child can trust. And the best way I could honor that love was to keep living, not because I wanted to, but because she would have wanted me to. Because every day that I survived, every step I took forward, was proof that her life had mattered, that she had made me stronger, not weaker, that love, even love that ends in loss, is never wasted. The fire crackled. Rain hammered against the windows. 3 wounded people sat together in the warm library, bound by grief and beginning to be bound by something else, something fragile and new and terrifying in its potential. I'm glad you came here, Lucy whispered. I'm glad you didn't give up. Eleanor pulled her closer. So am I, sweetheart. So am I. The rain stopped on the 28th day. Eleanor woke to silence, the absence of the constant drumming that had filled every moment for the past week, and rose to find the world washed clean. The sky was brilliant blue. The pastures were emerald green, and everywhere she looked, life was bursting forth with renewed energy. She had 2 days left. 2 days until her trial ended and Caleb Whitmore decided whether to keep her or send her away. The thought sent a cold spike of fear through her chest. She had become attached to this place, these people. Martha and Lucy had crept into her heart despite all her efforts to maintain professional distance. Even Caleb, with his walls and his silences and his wounded eyes, had become someone she thought about when she should have been thinking about other things. If he sent her away now, it would hurt. Really hurt. For the first time since Charlotte died, Eleanor had something to lose. She was still standing at her window, watching the sun rise over the wet pastures, when someone knocked at her door. It was Mrs. Patterson, her face grave. "Mr. Whitmore wants to see you in his study, right away." Eleanor's heart dropped into her stomach. Did he say why? He did not. But there was a letter this morning from Mrs. Ashworth's lawyers. The older woman's mouth thinned. "Whatever it says, it's bad. I've never seen him look like that." Eleanor dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, her mind racing through possibilities. A legal summons, a custody petition, some new attack that Helen Ashworth had devised in the week since her visit. She knocked on the study door and entered when Caleb's voice called her in. He was standing at his desk, a single sheet of paper in his hand. His face was the color of ash. "Close the door," he said. Eleanor did. Then she waited. "Mrs. Ashworth has filed for emergency custody of my daughters." Caleb's voice was flat, controlled, but Eleanor could hear the rage underneath. "She claims that I am mentally unstable and unable to provide proper care. She has evidence." "What kind of evidence?" He laughed, a terrible sound. "Witnesses. Ranch hands she must have bribed to testify that I drink too much, that I neglect my daughters, that I spend more time with my horses than my children. Letters from the governesses who left, describing my volatile temperament and emotional coldness. Medical records from Jim's injury last week, suggesting that I keep dangerous animals that threaten the safety of everyone on the property." Eleanor felt sick. "None of that proves you're unfit. It doesn't have to prove anything. It just has to create doubt. If a judge believes there's even a chance my daughters might be in danger." He set down the paper and pressed his hands flat against the desk. "The hearing is in 2 weeks, in Cheyenne. If I lose, Martha and Lucy go to Chicago with their grandmother." "You won't lose?" "You don't know that." "No, I don't." Eleanor stepped closer. "But I know that Martha and Lucy love you. I know that this ranch is their home, and you are their father, and no amount of money or manipulation should be able to take that away from them." "Should is not the same as will." "Then we make sure it is." Caleb looked at her then, really looked, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes that she had not seen before. Not just desperation, not just fear, but hope. Fragile, uncertain, but there. "We?" he repeated. "We. I am not going to stand by and watch that woman destroy your family, Mr. Whitmore. I have seen what you are to those girls. I have seen them start to trust again, start to hope again, because they know you will never abandon them. That is worth fighting for." "And what about your trial? Your 30 days are almost up." Eleanor lifted her chin. "Then extend the trial or end it early. I don't care about the terms anymore. I care about Martha and Lucy. I care about—" She stopped herself, but not quickly enough. "About what, Eleanor?" She met his eyes. "About this family. All of you. Even you, Caleb, with your walls and your silences and your wild horse that you refuse to give up on. I care about all of it." The study was very quiet. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting golden rectangles across the carpet. In the distance, a rooster crowed, and cattle lowed, and the ranch went about its business, oblivious to the moment unfolding in this room. Caleb Whitmore stepped around his desk until he was standing directly in front of Eleanor, close enough to touch. "When you arrived here," he said softly, "I thought you were just another drifter looking for a handout, another problem to be solved and sent on its way. But you are not that. You are something else entirely, something I did not expect." "What am I?" "I don't know yet. His hand rose, then dropped before it reached her face. "But I would very much like to find out, if you'll stay." "I'll stay." It was not a declaration of love. It was not a promise of forever. It was simply two wounded people choosing to face an uncertain future together, whatever that future might bring. But in that moment, standing in the morning light of the study while chaos threatened from every direction, it felt like enough. It felt like a beginning. The days that followed moved with the weight of a gathering storm. Caleb threw himself into preparations for the custody hearing, spending long hours locked in his study with his lawyer, a thin-faced man named Harrison who had traveled from Cheyenne to help build the defense. Letters went out to every person who might testify to Caleb's character: business associates, longtime ranchers, the minister from the church in town. Legal documents piled up on the desk like snowdrifts, and the tension in the house grew thick enough to taste. Eleanor kept the girls as sheltered from it as she could, but children are not easily fooled. Martha had taken to listening at doors again, her dark eyes following every visitor, every messenger, every piece of correspondence that arrived at the ranch. Lucy clung to Eleanor's skirts with an intensity that spoke of deep, wordless fear. "Are we going to have to leave?" Lucy asked one morning, her voice small and trembling. "Is grandmother going to take us away?" Eleanor knelt down to meet her eyes. "Your father is fighting very hard to make sure that doesn't happen, and I am going to help him fight. Do you trust me, Lucy?" The child nodded, though her lower lip still trembled. "Then trust that I will not let anyone take you anywhere you don't want to go, not without a fight." It was a promise Eleanor was not entirely sure she could keep, but she meant every word of it. On the 5th day after the letter arrived, Eleanor was helping Mrs. Patterson hang laundry in the side yard when she heard hoofbeats approaching fast from the main road. She set down the sheet she had been pinning and moved to the corner of the house, shading her eyes against the midday sun. A rider was coming up the drive at a gallop, his horse lathered and wild-eyed. It was one of the younger hands, Tommy, Eleanor thought his name was, and even from this distance she could see the panic on his face. He pulled up in front of the main house just as Caleb emerged onto the porch, drawn by the sound. "Mr. Whitmore, you need to come quick. It's Storm. He's gotten out again, and this time he's heading for town." Caleb's face went white, then hard. "How the hell did he get out?" "Don't know, sir. Gate was standing wide open when we came to check on him. Pete thinks someone let him out on purpose." Eleanor felt her stomach drop. Someone let him out on purpose. The words echoed in her head with terrible implications. Caleb was already moving, calling for his horse, shouting orders to the hands who had gathered at the sound of the commotion. Within minutes, a group of riders had assembled and was thundering down the drive toward town, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the still air. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. Storm loose in town was dangerous. A wild stallion among people who didn't know how to handle him. Among children who might run toward the excitement instead of away from it. But that wasn't what worried her most. If Storm hurt someone, if he killed someone, it would be exactly the kind of evidence Helen Ashworth needed to prove that Caleb Whitmore was unfit to care for his own daughters. A man who kept dangerous animals, who couldn't control his own property, who put innocent people at risk through negligence or incompetence. This was not an accident. This was sabotage. She turned and ran into the house, taking the stairs 2 at a time until she reached the schoolroom where Martha was supposed to be working on her arithmetic. The room was empty. Eleanor's heart stopped for a single, terrible beat. Then she heard it. Voices, coming from the direction of the back staircase that led down to the kitchen. She followed the sound and found Martha pressed against the wall at the bottom of the stairs, listening to a conversation taking place in the kitchen doorway. "Told you I don't know anything about a horse." The voice was unfamiliar, male, rough, defensive. "I'm just here looking for work." "There's no work here for strangers." That was Mrs. Patterson, her voice sharp with suspicion. "And I'll thank you to take yourself off this property before I call the hands." "The hands are all gone, ma'am. Rode off toward town a few minutes ago. Seems like something exciting is happening." A pause. "Must be lonely out here, with everyone gone. Just you and those 2 little girls." Eleanor moved before she could think. She stepped past Martha, pushed through the kitchen door, and found herself face to face with a man she had never seen before. He was tall and lean, with the look of someone who had spent too many years doing hard living. His clothes were worn but not ragged, and there was a calculating gleam in his pale eyes that made Eleanor's skin crawl. Mrs. Patterson was standing near the stove, a heavy iron skillet gripped in both hands like a weapon. Her face was set in lines of grim determination, but Eleanor could see the fear underneath. "Can I help you?" Eleanor's voice came out steady, calmer than she felt. The stranger's eyes swept over her, assessing. "Well, well, another lady of the house. This place is fuller than it looks." "I asked you a question. What do you want?" "Like I told the old woman, I'm looking for work. Thought a big ranch like this might have something for a man willing to do an honest day's labor." He smiled, and there was nothing honest in it. "But if there's no work, I suppose I could just stay for a visit. Get to know the place. Get to know the people." Behind Eleanor, Martha made a small sound of fear. The stranger's eyes flicked toward the noise, and his smile widened. "Is that one of the little girls I've heard so much about? Mrs. Ashworth did say they were pretty things." The name hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Mrs. Ashworth. Helen Ashworth had sent this man. "Get out." Eleanor's voice was ice. "Get out of this house now, or I will make you regret ever setting foot on this property." The stranger laughed. "Is that so? And what's a skinny little thing like you going to do about it?" Eleanor did not answer with words. She moved, fast, faster than she had moved in years, driven by an instinct she did not know she possessed. Her hand closed around the handle of the knife that lay on the kitchen table, the one Mrs. Patterson had been using to peel potatoes, and before the stranger could react, the blade was pressed against his throat. "I said get out!" The man had gone very still. The laughter had died in his throat, replaced by something that might have been fear or might have been calculation. "Easy now," he said carefully. "No need for anyone to get hurt. Then leave. Now. And tell Mrs. Ashworth that if she sends anyone else to terrorize this family, she will answer for it. Not in court, not in front of lawyers. To me." For a long moment, no one moved. Then the stranger took a slow step backward, then another, until the knife was no longer touching his skin. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Mrs. Ashworth is a powerful woman. She has friends in high places. You can't protect these people forever. Watch me." The stranger held her gaze for one more heartbeat. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen, through the back door, and across the yard toward a horse that Eleanor hadn't noticed tethered by the fence. She stood there, knife still gripped in her hand, until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely into the distance. Then her knees gave out. Mrs. Patterson was there to catch her, lowering her into a chair with surprising gentleness, for a woman who had never shown her anything but cool professionalism. "Breathe," the older woman said firmly. "Just breathe. It's over." "It's not over." Eleanor's voice was shaking now, the adrenaline draining out of her and leaving only fear in its wake. "It's just beginning. She sent him, Mrs. Patterson. Helen Ashworth sent that man here to what? Scare us? Hurt us? Take the girls while their father was gone?" "I know." Mrs. Patterson's face was grim. "I know what she is. I've known since before she came to this house 3 weeks ago. That woman has no soul. She never loved her daughter, and she certainly doesn't love those grandchildren. All she cares about is winning." Martha emerged from the doorway, her face pale but determined. "Is he gone?" "He's gone. Is he coming back?" Eleanor looked at this fierce little girl who had already lost so much and was about to lose more, and felt something harden inside her chest. "Not if I have anything to say about it." She rose to her feet, steadier now. "Martha, where is your sister?" "In our room. I told her to hide under the bed and not come out until I said it was safe." "Good girl. Go to her. Stay together. Don't open the door for anyone except me or Mrs. Patterson or your father. Do you understand?" Martha nodded and ran. Eleanor turned to Mrs. Patterson. "Is there a gun in this house?" The older woman's eyes widened slightly, but she did not hesitate. "Mr. Whitmore keeps a rifle in the study, and there's a shotgun in the barn. Get the rifle, load it, and pray that we don't have to use it." The men returned an hour later, dusty and exhausted, but triumphant. They had caught Storm before he reached town, though it had taken 6 men and nearly 2 miles of hard riding to corner him. No one had been hurt, no property had been damaged, and the wild stallion was now secured in the most fortified stall on the property. But their triumph turned to horror when they learned what had happened at the house. Caleb listened to Eleanor's account in complete silence, his face growing darker with every word. When she finished, he stood absolutely still for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "She sent a man to my home," he said, his voice quiet and deadly, "to terrorize my children, while I was gone chasing a horse that someone deliberately set loose." "Yes." "And you held him off with a kitchen knife?" "Yes." Caleb looked at her, really looked, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes that she had not seen before. Not just gratitude, not just respect, but something deeper. Something that looked almost like awe. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, without taking his eyes off Eleanor, "please prepare the spare bedroom in the main house, the one adjacent to the girls' room." The housekeeper blinked. "Sir?" "Mrs. Brooks will be sleeping in the main house from now on, near the children." He paused. "Near us." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, though she was not entirely sure why. "Mr. Whitmore, that isn't necessary." "It is absolutely necessary. I will not leave my daughters unprotected again, and you have proven that you are more capable of protecting them than half the hands on this ranch." His jaw tightened. "I should have made this decision weeks ago. I was too proud, too concerned with propriety. I won't make that mistake again." Mrs. Patterson exchanged a glance with Eleanor that communicated volumes, surprise, approval, and perhaps a hint of speculation about what this change in arrangements might mean, but she simply nodded and went to prepare the room. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her new bed, larger and softer than anything she had slept in for months, and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. Through the wall, she could hear the girls' soft breathing, the occasional rustle of blankets as one of them turned in her sleep. They were safe, for now. But the threat was not gone. It was only waiting. The days that followed felt like living under siege. Caleb hired additional men to patrol the property boundaries and posted guards at the gates around the clock. The lawyer, Harrison, sent investigators to dig into the background of the man Eleanor had confronted. They found nothing, as she had expected. Helen Ashworth was too careful to leave evidence that could be traced back to her. But the incident had changed something. The uncertainty that had hung over everything since the custody letter arrived had crystallized into something harder, something more determined. This was no longer a legal dispute to be settled in courtrooms. This was a war, and Helen Ashworth had fired the first shot. Eleanor threw herself into the battle with everything she had. She spent hours with the girls, not just on lessons, but on preparing them for what was coming. The custody hearing would likely require them to speak, to tell a judge, in their own words, where they wanted to live and why. It was a terrible burden to place on children so young, but Eleanor knew that their testimony might be the most powerful weapon in Caleb's arsenal. "You don't have to lie," she told them one afternoon as they sat together in the library. "You don't have to pretend everything is perfect. You just have to tell the truth about your life here, about your father, about what you want." "What if they don't believe us?" Martha asked. Her voice was steady, but Eleanor could see the fear in her eyes. "Then we find other ways to make them believe. But the truth is powerful, Martha. It has a weight that lies don't have. And the truth is that your father loves you. This ranch is your home, and no one has the right to take you away from either of those things." "What about you?" Lucy asked quietly. "Will you tell the truth too?" Eleanor felt her heart constrict. "If they let me speak, yes. I will tell them everything I have seen in this house, everything I know about your father and this family." "They have to let you speak," Martha said fiercely. "You've seen more than anyone. You know what grandmother really is." "We'll see what happens." Eleanor reached out and took both girls' hands in her own. "But no matter what, I want you to remember something. Whatever the judge decides, whatever happens at that hearing, you're not alone. You have your father, and you have me, and we will never stop fighting for you. Do you understand?" Both girls nodded, their eyes bright with unshed tears. "Good." Eleanor squeezed their hands. "Now, let's practice your statements one more time." The hearing was 9 days away when the second attack came. This time, it was not a stranger at the door. It was something far more insidious. Eleanor was reviewing Martha's composition assignment, an essay about life on the ranch, when Mrs. Patterson burst into the schoolroom, her face ashen. "You need to come downstairs now, both of you." They found Caleb in the study, standing over his desk with a piece of paper clutched in his hand. His face was the color of chalk, and there was a tremor in his hands that Eleanor had never seen before. "What is it?" she asked. "What's happened?" Caleb did not speak. He simply handed her the paper. It was a letter, written in a flowing feminine script that Eleanor did not recognize. But as she read the words, understanding came crashing down on her like a collapsing roof. "My dearest Caleb, I know I have no right to contact you after all this time. What I did was unforgivable, and I do not expect your forgiveness. But I have heard about the custody hearing, and I cannot stay silent any longer. Mother is not acting out of love for Martha and Lucy. She is acting out of spite. Spite toward you and spite toward me for choosing love over duty. If she gains custody of our daughters, it will not be to care for them. It will be to punish us both. I am prepared to testify at the hearing, to tell the truth about my mother's character, her motivations, and the kind of home she would provide for our children. It is the least I can do, after everything I have put you through. Please respond if you are willing to consider this. I will understand if you are not." Margaret Eleanor looked up from the letter, her mind reeling. Margaret, Caleb's wife. The woman who had abandoned her husband and children 2 years ago and had not been heard from since. "Is this real?" she asked. "Could it be a forgery?" "I don't know." Caleb's voice was rough. "The handwriting looks right. The style is hers. But after everything else Helen has done, I can't trust anything anymore." "What does she want?" "She says she wants to help, to testify against her mother." He laughed, a bitter sound. "The woman who destroyed my family wants to help save it. Do you see the irony?" Eleanor chose her next words carefully. "Do you believe her?" "I don't know what I believe. I thought I knew her, thought I understood who she was and what she wanted. I was wrong about everything." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of exhaustion she had come to recognize. "If this is real, her testimony could change everything. A mother willing to admit that her own mother is unfit to care for her children, no judge would ignore that. And if it's not real? If it's a trap? Then I walk into Helen's hands and lose everything." The study was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Eleanor looked at Caleb, at the lines of strain around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the desperation barely contained beneath his carefully controlled exterior, and made a decision. "Let me meet her." Caleb's head snapped up. "What?" "Margaret. If she's genuine, she'll agree to meet with someone other than you first. Someone who can assess her sincerity without the emotional complications of your history. If she's not genuine, if this is a trap, I'll see through it." "Eleanor, I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking, I'm offering." She met his eyes steadily. "You have been protecting your daughters for 2 years, Caleb, fighting every battle, bearing every burden, carrying the weight of this family on your shoulders alone. Let me help carry it. Let me do this." For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Then slowly, something in his expression shifted. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why do you care so much about my family? You have no obligation to us beyond the job I hired you to do." Eleanor considered the question. She could give him a dozen practical answers, that she needed the work, that she had nowhere else to go, that the girls deserved better than to be pawns in their grandmother's vendetta. All of those things were true, but they were not the whole truth. "Because when I arrived at your gates," she said softly, "I was dead inside. I had been walking for weeks, starving, grieving, with nothing left to live for. I knocked on 17 doors, and every one of them turned me away. But you looked at me and saw something worth saving. You gave me a chance when no one else would. And that chance," she paused, swallowing hard, "that chance gave me back my life. How could I not fight for the people who made that possible?" Caleb was very still. The afternoon light slanted through the study windows, casting golden shadows across his face. "Eleanor." Her name on his lips was almost a whisper. "Write to Margaret," Eleanor said, before he could say whatever was building in his eyes. "Tell her I will meet her, somewhere public, somewhere safe, and we will see what kind of woman she really is." The meeting was arranged for 3 days later, at a small hotel in the town of Riverton, 20 miles from Highland, Crest. Eleanor traveled alone over Caleb's objections, reasoning that Margaret was more likely to speak honestly to a single woman than to anyone who looked like an escort or a bodyguard. The hotel was modest but clean, with a small dining room that overlooked the main street. Eleanor arrived early, choosing a table near the window where she could watch the road, and ordered tea she had no intention of drinking. Margaret Whitmore arrived precisely on time. She was exactly as beautiful as her portrait had suggested: dark hair, green eyes, a face that belonged on the cover of a magazine rather than in a dusty Wyoming hotel. But there was something different about her in person. The triumphant confidence that had radiated from the painting was gone, replaced by something more uncertain, more human. She spotted Eleanor immediately, the only other woman in the room, and crossed to her table with careful, measured steps. "Mrs. Brooks?" "Mrs. Whitmore." Eleanor did not rise or offer her hand. "Please sit." Margaret sat. Up close, the changes were even more apparent. There were shadows under her eyes that cosmetics could not quite conceal, and lines of strain around her mouth that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult choices. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," Margaret said. Her voice was lower than Eleanor had expected, slightly husky. "I know you have no reason to trust me." "No, I don't. Your mother has made several attempts to harm your daughters and terrorize your household. For all I know, this is another one." Margaret flinched at the directness, but she did not look away. "I deserve that. I deserve worse." She took a breath. "What can I say to convince you that I'm sincere?" "You can start by telling me the truth. Why did you leave?" The question hung in the air between them. For a long moment, Margaret did not speak. Then slowly she began. "I was suffocating. That's the only way I can describe it. The ranch, the isolation, the endless routines. It felt like being buried alive. And Caleb," she shook her head. "He was a good man, a good father, but he was never fully present with me. His heart was always somewhere else, with the land, with the cattle, with some vision of the future that didn't seem to include me as anything more than a decorative accessory." "So you found someone who did include you?" "Yes." Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "David, he was everything Caleb wasn't: attentive, passionate, fully focused on me. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt since before the girls were born. And now? Now David is gone. He left me 6 months ago for a younger woman with fewer complications." A bitter smile crossed Margaret's face. "Poetic justice, I suppose. I abandoned my family for a man who abandoned me in turn." Eleanor studied her carefully. "And that's why you want to help? Because you have nothing left to lose?" "Partly." Margaret met her eyes directly. "But mostly because of my daughters. I know what my mother is, Mrs. Brooks. I know what she's capable of. She raised me to be an ornament, a trophy, something to be displayed and admired but never truly loved. If she gets custody of Martha and Lucy, she will do the same to them. She will strip away everything that makes them who they are and turn them into perfect hollow shells of the girls they should have been. Why didn't you come back? If you cared about your daughters so much, why didn't you fight for them?" "Because I was ashamed." Margaret's voice cracked. "Because I couldn't face Caleb, couldn't face the girls, couldn't stand the thought of seeing the hatred in their eyes when they looked at me. I told myself they were better off without me, that they would forget me eventually and build a new life with someone who deserved them. And now? Now I realize that was cowardly, that running away solved nothing and only made everything worse." Margaret leaned forward, her green eyes intense. "I cannot undo what I did, Mrs. Brooks. I cannot go back and be the mother my daughters deserved. But I can stop my mother from destroying what Caleb has built. I can stand up in that courtroom and tell the truth about who she really is. It's not redemption. It's just the right thing to do." Finally, Eleanor sat in silence for a long moment, weighing everything she had heard. The story fit with what she knew of Margaret from Caleb's account, and from the fragments the girls had shared. The pain in her voice seemed genuine. The shame in her eyes was hard to fake, but trusting her was still an enormous risk. "If you're lying to me," Eleanor said quietly, "if this is some scheme of your mother's that you're helping to carry out, I will destroy you. Not legally, not politely. I will find every secret you've ever hidden and drag it into the light for the whole world to see. Do you understand?" Margaret did not flinch. "I understand. And if you're telling the truth, if you genuinely want to help, you will follow my instructions exactly. You will not contact Caleb directly. You will not attempt to see the girls. You will provide your testimony through proper legal channels, and then you will disappear back to wherever you came from. These children have been through enough without adding the confusion of a mother who might leave again." "That's fair." Margaret's voice was steady. "I don't expect to be welcomed back into their lives. I just want to make sure they're safe." Eleanor rose from the table. "Then we have an agreement. Mr. Harrison, Caleb's lawyer, will be in contact with instructions for your deposition. If you follow through on your promises, you may yet do some good in this world, Mrs. Whitmore. If you don't—" She left the threat unfinished. Some things did not need to be said aloud. The return journey to Highland Crest took 3 hours, and Eleanor spent every minute of it replaying the conversation in her mind, searching for cracks in Margaret's story, inconsistencies in her account, any sign that she had missed something crucial. She found none. Either Margaret was the most accomplished liar Eleanor had ever encountered, or she was telling the truth. By the time the ranch gates came into view, Eleanor had made her decision. Caleb was waiting on the front porch when she arrived, his face tight with anxiety. The girls were nowhere to be seen, safely inside with Mrs. Patterson, Eleanor assumed. "Well?" he demanded as she climbed down from the carriage. "What did she say? Is it real?" "I believe it is." Something flickered in Caleb's eyes. Relief, anger, confusion, all tangled together in a knot too complex to unravel. "You believe her?" "I believe she is genuinely trying to make amends for the damage she's caused. Whether her motivations are pure or simply self-serving, I cannot say. But her testimony will help your case, and that is what matters." "And the girls? Does she expect to see them?" "No. I made it clear that was not an option. She accepted it without argument." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the distant hills. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. "I loved her once, before everything fell apart, before she became someone I didn't recognize." He shook his head. "I used to lie awake at night wondering what I did wrong, what I could have changed, whether it was my fault that she left. And now I realize it doesn't matter. Fault, blame, who did what to whom. None of it changes what happened. The only thing that matters is protecting my daughters, building something good from the wreckage." He turned to look at Eleanor. "You've helped me see that, more than you know." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she did not look away. "I only did what anyone would have done." "No. You did what you would have done, and that, Mrs. Brooks, is not the same thing at all." They stood there on the porch as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Something had shifted between them, something that had been building since the day Eleanor first appeared at those iron gates, ragged and hungry and refusing to beg. It was not love, not yet, but it was the soil from which love might grow, given time and care. The custody hearing was 5 days away. The battle was far from over. But for the first time since the nightmare began, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that they might actually win. The evening before the hearing, Eleanor found Martha sitting alone in the library, staring at the empty fireplace with an expression that seemed far too old for her 9 years. "Can't sleep?" Eleanor asked softly, settling into the chair beside her. Martha shook her head. "Every time I close my eyes, I see her. Grandmother. Standing in front of a judge, telling lies about father, saying he doesn't love us, saying we'd be better off with her. Her hands clenched into fists in her lap. I hate her." "I know. Do you think she'll win?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I think your father has a strong case. I think Margaret's testimony will help. And I think that when the judge hears you and Lucy speak, when he sees how much you love your home and your father, he will make the right decision. But you're not sure." "No one can be sure about anything, Martha. But being unsure doesn't mean giving up. It means fighting anyway, even when the outcome is uncertain." Martha was quiet for a moment, then very softly. "Mrs. Brooks, what happens to you if we lose?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. What do you mean? Father hired you to take care of us. If grandmother takes us away, you won't have a job anymore. You'll have to leave. Martha's voice trembled slightly. You'll have nowhere to go again. Eleanor felt something twist in her chest. This child, facing the possible destruction of everything she knew, was worried about what would happen to her governess. Martha, look at me. The girl raised her eyes. Whatever happens tomorrow, I am not leaving you. Even if the judge rules against your father, even if you have to go to Chicago, I will find a way to stay in your life. I will write to you. I will visit if I can. And if there is ever any way for me to help you come back home, I will move heaven and earth to make it happen. She reached out and took Martha's hand. You are not just a job to me. You and Lucy and your father, you have become my family. And family does not abandon each other, not ever. Martha stared at her for a long moment. Then, without warning, she threw herself into Eleanor's arms and began to cry. Great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, released after months or years of being held back. Eleanor held her close, stroking her hair, murmuring soft words of comfort. And when the tears finally subsided and Martha fell asleep against her shoulder, Eleanor lifted her gently and carried her upstairs to her bed, tucking the blankets around her small form with a tenderness that surprised even herself. In the next bed, Lucy was already asleep, one arm wrapped around a pillow, the other clutching a small stuffed horse that had seen better days. Eleanor stood there for a moment, looking at these two wounded, beautiful girls who had somehow become the center of her world. Tomorrow would bring the fight of their lives. Tomorrow, everything they had built, every small victory, every moment of connection, every fragile thread of trust, would be put to the test. But tonight, they were safe. Tonight, they were loved. And tomorrow, Eleanor would make sure the whole world knew it. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and cold, with clouds hanging low over the mountains like a shroud. Eleanor was awake before the sun, standing at her window and watching the first pale light creep across the frosted pastures. She had not slept more than a few hours, her mind churning through every possible outcome, every argument, every way this day could go wrong. Behind her, the house was slowly coming to life. She could hear Mrs. Patterson moving in the kitchen below, the clatter of pots and the smell of coffee drifting up through the floorboards. Somewhere down the hall, one of the girls coughed in her sleep. This was it. Everything they had fought for, everything they had endured, came down to today. Eleanor dressed carefully in the best clothes she owned, the same gray dress she had worn on her first day at Highland Crest, now cleaned and pressed until it looked almost respectable. She pinned her hair back severely, checked her reflection in the small mirror, and went to wake the girls. Martha was already awake, sitting on the edge of her bed with her hands folded in her lap. She was wearing the blue dress that had belonged to her mother, the one she had refused to touch for 2 years, until last night when she had pulled it from the back of her wardrobe and announced that she wanted to wear it to the hearing. It's not because I forgive her, Martha had said quietly, smoothing the fabric with trembling hands. It's because I want grandmother to see that I'm not afraid, that I'm not ashamed of who I am or where I come from. Now, in the gray morning light, she looked older than her 9 years, older and fiercer and more determined than any child should have to be. Are you ready? Eleanor asked. Martha nodded. I've been practicing what I'm going to say, all night, in my head. You don't have to memorize anything, sweetheart. Just tell the truth. I know, but I want to get it right. I want them to understand. Martha's dark eyes met Eleanor's. I want them to know what Father has done for us, what you've done. I want them to see. Eleanor crossed to her and knelt down, taking both of Martha's hands in her own. They will see, Martha. I promise you, they will see. Lucy was harder to wake. She had been restless all night, plagued by dreams she would not describe. And when Eleanor finally coaxed her out of bed, she clung to Eleanor's hand with a grip that spoke of deep, wordless fear. I don't want to go, Lucy whispered. I don't want to talk to the judge. What if I say something wrong? You won't say anything wrong, Eleanor assured her. You're just going to tell him about your life, about your home and your father and what makes you happy. That's all. But what if he doesn't believe me? Then we'll make him believe. Together. Eleanor smoothed Lucy's tangled hair away from her face. You're the bravest little girl I have ever met, Lucy Whitmore. You survived your mother leaving. You survived 2 years of fear and uncertainty. You can survive one conversation with a judge." Lucy's lower lip trembled, but she nodded. "Will you be there? In the room with me?" "I will be right outside the door, and the moment you're done, I will be waiting to take you home." "Promise?" "I promise." The journey to Cheyenne took 4 hours by carriage. Caleb drove, his jaw set in a hard line, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He had barely spoken since dawn, and Eleanor could see the tension in every line of his body, the way he gripped the reins, the rigid set of his shoulders, the muscle twitching in his cheek. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer some word of comfort or reassurance, but she knew that nothing she could say would ease the weight he was carrying. This was his battle, his family, his future. All she could do was stand beside him and hope it was enough. The girls sat in the back of the carriage, pressed close together under a heavy blanket. Martha stared out the window at the passing landscape, her expression unreadable. Lucy had fallen asleep with her head on her sister's shoulder, her face peaceful in a way it had not been for weeks. They arrived in Cheyenne just before noon. The courthouse was an imposing building of red brick and white columns, designed to intimidate anyone who entered its doors. A crowd had gathered on the steps. Reporters, Eleanor realized with a sinking feeling. Word of the custody battle had spread, and the vultures had come to feed. "Stay close to me," Caleb said, helping the girls down from the carriage. "Don't speak to anyone. Don't look at anyone. Just walk." They pushed through the crowd, ignoring the shouted questions and the flash of camera bulbs. Eleanor kept one hand on Lucy's shoulder and the other on Martha's back, guiding them forward, shielding them as best she could from the chaos around them. Inside, the courthouse was quieter, but no less intimidating. Their footsteps echoed on the marble floors as they made their way to the courtroom where the hearing would be held. Harrison, the lawyer, was waiting for them outside the heavy wooden doors. His face was grave, but not hopeless. "The judge is Jacob Harrington," he said quietly. 62 years old, known for being thorough and fair. He's not the type to be swayed by wealth or influence. He'll want to hear the facts and make his own decision. "Is that good for us?" Caleb asked. "It's better than the alternative. Helen Ashworth tried to get the case assigned to a judge she's connected to socially, but her request was denied." Harrison straightened his jacket. "We have a chance, Caleb, a real chance. Just stay calm, answer honestly, and let me do my job." They entered the courtroom together. It was smaller than Eleanor had expected. A single room with wooden benches, a raised platform for the judge, and 2 tables facing each other across a narrow aisle. The windows were tall and narrow, letting in pale winter light that did nothing to warm the chill in the air. Helen Ashworth was already seated at the table on the right, flanked by 2 lawyers in expensive suits. She looked exactly as she had on the day she came to Highland Crest, polished, perfect, utterly without warmth. Her eyes swept over Eleanor and the girls without acknowledgement, dismissing them as beneath her notice. But when her gaze landed on Caleb, something flickered in those cold green eyes. Satisfaction, Eleanor thought. She thinks she's already won. They took their places at the table on the left. Martha sat rigidly between Eleanor and her father, her small hands gripping the edge of her chair. Lucy was on Eleanor's other side, pressed so close that Eleanor could feel her trembling. The doors at the back of the room opened and the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Jacob Harrington." Everyone stood as the judge entered. A tall, silver-haired man with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He took his seat behind the raised desk, arranged his papers, and looked out at the assembled parties with eyes that seemed to see everything. "Be seated," he said. His voice was deep and measured, carrying easily through the silent room. "This court is now in session. The matter before us today is the petition of Helen Ashworth for emergency custody of the minor children Martha Jane Whitmore and Lucy Ann Whitmore, currently in the care of their father, Caleb James Whitmore." He looked at Helen's table. "Counsel for the petitioner, you may present your opening statement." The lead lawyer rose, a slick, silver-tongued man named Bradford, who had clearly been chosen for his ability to make the worst things sound reasonable. "Your Honor," he began, "we are here today because 2 innocent children are being raised in an environment that is fundamentally unsafe. Their father, while perhaps well-intentioned, has demonstrated a pattern of negligence and emotional instability that puts them at risk. He keeps dangerous animals on his property. He hires unvetted strangers to care for his children. He has failed to provide the stability, education, and nurturing environment that these girls desperately need. Bradford gestured toward Helen. Mrs. Ashworth, by contrast, offers them everything their father cannot: a proper home in a civilized city, the finest schools, access to society and culture and opportunities that are simply unavailable on a remote Wyoming ranch. She is a woman of means, of standing, of impeccable reputation. She has the resources and the desire to give her granddaughters the life they deserve. He paused, letting his words sink in. We are not here to destroy a family, Your Honor. We are here to save 2 children from a situation that is slowly destroying them. We ask only that this court do what is right, what is best, for Martha and Lucy Whitmore. He sat down. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Judge Harrington turned to the other table. Counsel for the respondent. Harrison rose, his manner calm and measured. Your Honor, my client does not dispute that he faces challenges. Running a ranch of this size while raising 2 young daughters alone is not easy. But difficulty is not the same as unfitness, and challenge is not the same as neglect. He moved out from behind the table, addressing the judge directly. The petitioner asked this court to remove 2 children from the only home they have ever known, from the father who has loved and cared for them since birth, and place them in the custody of a grandmother who has shown virtually no interest in their welfare until now. A grandmother who, by her own daughter's account, was a cold and controlling parent who drove her child away and has spent the years since nursing grievances rather than building relationships. A murmur rippled through the small room. Eleanor saw Helen's face tighten. We will present evidence today that Mrs. Ashworth's petition is not motivated by concern for her grandchildren, but by a desire to punish her former son-in-law for a marriage that did not meet her expectations. We will show that the so-called dangerous environment at Highland Crest Ranch is nothing more than a working family property where children are taught responsibility, hard work, and the value of honest labor. And we will demonstrate that the unvetted stranger Mrs. Ashworth's counsel mentioned is in fact a woman of extraordinary character who has become an invaluable part of this family's life. Harrison returned to his seat. The respondent asks only that this court look beyond the petitioner's wealth and influence and see the truth, that Martha and Lucy Whitmore belong with their father, in their home, living the life they have chosen for themselves. Judge Harrington made a note on his papers. The court will now hear testimony. Petitioner may call their first witness. What followed was 3 hours of carefully orchestrated character assassination. Bradford called witness after witness, former employees of Highland Crest who testified to Caleb's volatile temper and neglectful parenting. A doctor who described Jim's injuries from Storm's kick in lurid detail, implying that the children could have been hurt just as easily. A school teacher from town who expressed concern about Martha's social isolation and inappropriate maturity for her age. Each witness was cross-examined by Harrison, but the damage accumulated like water dripping on stone. By the time Bradford called his final witness, Eleanor could see the doubt creeping into Judge Harrington's eyes. The petitioner calls Margaret Whitmore. Eleanor's head snapped up. Beside her, Caleb went rigid. Margaret walked into the courtroom from a side door, her face pale but composed. She was dressed simply in a dark blue traveling suit that made her look younger than her years. She did not look at Caleb or the girls. She did not look at her mother. She walked to the witness stand, took the oath, and sat down. Bradford approached her with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for being here today. I wasn't given much choice. Margaret's voice was steady, but Eleanor could hear the tension underneath. Let's begin with your relationship with your former husband. Would you describe your marriage as happy? No, I would not. Can you elaborate? Margaret took a breath. Caleb is a good man, but he was not a good husband. He was distant, preoccupied, more interested in his work than in his family. I felt invisible in my own home. And is that why you left? Partly. I also made mistakes of my own. I was young and unhappy, and I made choices I am not proud of. Bradford nodded sympathetically. And now, looking back, Do you believe your daughters are safe in their father's care? The room went very still. Margaret looked up directly at the judge. My daughters are not safe anywhere near my mother. The silence that followed was absolute. Bradford's face went slack with shock. Helen Ashworth half rose from her seat, her mouth opening in outrage. Judge Harrington leaned forward, his eyes sharp. Explain that statement, Mrs. Whitmore, he said. Margaret turned to face him fully, her voice growing stronger with every word. I was raised by Helen Ashworth, Your Honor. I know exactly what kind of home she provides. It is a home without warmth, without affection, without any regard for the feelings or needs of children. I was treated as a possession, an ornament, a reflection of her own ambitions. Every choice I made, what to wear, what to study, who to befriend, was dictated by what would make her look best in the eyes of society. She drew a shaky breath. When I married Caleb, it was partly to escape her. When I left him, she used my failure as proof that I was worthless, just as she had always believed. And now she wants my daughters, not because she loves them, not because she cares about their welfare, but because taking them away from Caleb is the only revenge she has left. Helen was on her feet now, her face twisted with fury. This is lies. This is... Mrs. Ashworth, sit down, Judge Harrington said, his voice like iron. You will have your opportunity to respond. Continue, Mrs. Whitmore. Margaret's hands were trembling, but she pressed on. I am not here to defend myself, Your Honor. I abandoned my children. I ran away from my responsibilities. That is a shame I will carry for the rest of my life. But I am here to tell you the truth about my mother because my daughters deserve better than to become her next victims. She finally looked at Caleb, and her eyes were bright with tears. Caleb Whitmore is not perfect. He made mistakes in our marriage, just as I did. But he loves those girls with everything he has. He has devoted the past 2 years to protecting them, providing for them, building a life for them despite everything I put him through. Whatever happens today, whatever this court decides, I want it known that I believe with all my heart that my daughters belong with their father. The courtroom erupted. Helen was screaming at her lawyers. Bradford was trying desperately to regain control of his witness. The gallery was buzzing with shocked whispers. Through it all, Judge Harrington sat silent, watching Margaret with an expression that Eleanor could not read. When order was finally restored, the judge spoke directly to Margaret. Mrs. Whitmore, are you aware that your testimony directly contradicts the position of the petitioner who brought you here? Yes, Your Honor. And you stand by your statements? Every word. Judge Harrington nodded slowly. The witness is excused. He turned to Bradford, whose face had gone the color of sour milk. Does the petitioner wish to continue? Bradford glanced at Helen, who was white-lipped with rage. After a long moment, he said, The petitioner rests, Your Honor. Very well, the respondent may now present their case. Harrison rose, and Eleanor could see the barely suppressed triumph in his eyes. Margaret's testimony had been devastating, far more powerful than anything they could have hoped for, but they still had work to do. The respondent calls Eleanor Brooks. Eleanor's heart stopped for just a moment. Then she squeezed Martha's hand, rose from her seat, and walked to the witness stand. The oath felt heavy on her tongue, a promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. She sat down in the hard wooden chair and faced the courtroom. Harrison approached her gently. Mrs. Brooks, please tell the court how you came to be employed at Highland Crest Ranch. Eleanor told the story simply, without embellishment. The weeks of walking, the 17 rejections, the morning she arrived at Caleb's gates with nothing but hunger and determination. She described the trial he had offered her, the challenges she had faced, the slow process of earning the girl's trust. And what is your assessment of Mr. Whitmore as a father? Harrison asked. He is devoted to his daughters, Eleanor said firmly. He has sacrificed his own happiness, his own peace of mind, his own chance at moving on from his wife's betrayal, all to protect Martha and Lucy. He is not perfect. He struggles to express his emotions. He works too hard and worries too much. But there is no question in my mind that those girls are the center of his world. And the ranch environment? Is it dangerous for children? Eleanor almost smiled. Your Honor, I grew up on a farm in Missouri. I have seen children raised around animals all my life. Yes, there are risks. There are risks everywhere. But the skills those girls are learning, responsibility, hard work, respect for nature, are worth far more than any amount of so-called civilized education. Bradford rose for cross-examination, his manner aggressive. Mrs. Brooks, isn't it true that you arrived at Highland Crest Ranch as a vagrant? A homeless woman with no references, no connections, no proof of your background? I was homeless, Eleanor agreed. I was not a vagrant. There is a difference. And yet Mr. Whitmore hired you to care for his children, despite knowing nothing about you. Doesn't that suggest a certain recklessness in his judgment? It suggests compassion, Mr. Bradford. It suggests the ability to see potential where others see only problems. Eleanor met his eyes steadily. I was given a chance when I had nothing. I have repaid that chance with loyalty and hard work. If that is recklessness, then I think the world could use more of it. Bradford tried several more angles of attack, but Eleanor held firm. By the time he sat down, visibly frustrated, she could see that the tide had shifted. Harrison called the ranch hands next. Old Pete, Jim, with his arm still in a sling, half a dozen others who had worked at Highland Crest for years. Each one testified to Caleb's character, his fairness, his dedication to his family and his land. And then, finally, it was the girl's turn. Martha went first. She walked to the witness stand with her head high, and her mother's blue dress shimmering in the courtroom light. She answered the judge's questions in a clear, steady voice, describing her life at the ranch, her lessons with Eleanor, her love for her father. "And what do you want, Martha?" Judge Harrington asked gently. "If this court could give you anything, what would it be?" Martha looked directly at her grandmother, the first time she had acknowledged her presence all day. "I want to go home," she said simply. "I want to live at Highland Crest with my father and my sister and Mrs. Brooks. I want to ride horses and do my lessons and watch the sun set over the mountains. That's all I've ever wanted." Her voice hardened. "And I don't want to live with someone who only sees me as a weapon to hurt my father with." Helen Ashworth flinched as if she had been struck. Lucy was called next. She was so small that she had to sit on a cushion to see over the edge of the witness stand, and her voice was barely above a whisper. But when Judge Harrington asked her the same question, "What do you want?" her answer was immediate. "I want to stay with Father, and with Mrs. Brooks." She looked at Eleanor, and her gray eyes were bright with tears. "She's the first person since Mama left who made me feel safe. I don't want to lose her too." The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Harrington studied the small girl before him for a long moment. Then he nodded and told her she could step down. Lucy ran straight to Eleanor, who caught her in her arms and held her close. "Both sides will now present closing arguments," the judge announced. Bradford went first, but his words felt hollow now, a desperate attempt to salvage a case that had crumbled before his eyes. He spoke of opportunity and privilege and proper upbringing, but every argument rang false against the testimony that had come before. Harrison's closing was brief and devastating. "Your Honor, you have heard from the children themselves. You have heard from the woman who raised them and the woman who wants to take them. The choice before you is simple. Do we honor the wishes of two young girls who know exactly where they belong, or do we tear them from their home to satisfy the vendetta of a grandmother who has never shown them love?" He returned to his seat. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Harrington sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. He looked at his notes. He looked at Helen Ashworth, still rigid with fury at her table. He looked at Caleb, who had not moved or spoken throughout the entire proceedings. And then he looked at Martha and Lucy, huddled together on the bench beside Eleanor, their small hands clasped tight. "This court finds," he said slowly, "that the petition for emergency custody is denied." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before their meaning sank in. Then Martha let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and threw her arms around her father. Lucy buried her face in Eleanor's shoulder and wept. Caleb sat frozen, his face blank with shock. Eleanor watched him struggle to process what had just happened, the battle he had been fighting for months, suddenly over. 1. Judge Harrington was still speaking, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Furthermore, this court finds that the petitioner's claims of parental unfitness are without merit. The evidence presented today suggests not a father who has failed his children, but one who has dedicated himself to their welfare under extraordinarily difficult circumstances." He turned to Helen Ashworth, and his voice hardened. Mrs. Ashworth, this court is deeply troubled by the tactics employed in pursuit of this petition. The intimidation of witnesses, the manipulation of evidence, the apparent attempt to use your own daughter as an unwitting tool against her former husband. These are not the actions of someone motivated by concern for children. They are the actions of someone motivated by spite. Helen's face had gone white. Her lawyers were whispering urgently, but she did not seem to hear them. I am referring this matter to the district attorney for investigation, Judge Harrington continued. If evidence of criminal conduct is found, charges may follow. He paused. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell. The room exploded into noise and motion, but Eleanor barely noticed. She was too busy holding Lucy, watching Caleb embrace his daughters, feeling the weight of months of fear and tension finally begin to lift from her shoulders. They had won. Against all odds, against wealth and power, and a grandmother's vengeance, they had won. The journey home felt different. The same road, the same carriage, the same gray winter landscape stretching out in every direction. But the air inside the carriage was lighter somehow, charged with a relief so profound it was almost dizzying. The girls fell asleep within the first hour, exhausted by the emotional toll of the day. They lay curled together on the bench seat, Martha's arm wrapped protectively around her little sister, their faces peaceful for the first time in weeks. Eleanor sat across from them, watching the rise and fall of their breathing, and felt something shift in her chest. A knot she had not even realized was there, slowly beginning to unravel. Caleb was silent for most of the journey, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. But as they crested the final hill and Highland Crest came into view, the stone walls, the iron gates, the smoke rising from the chimneys, he finally spoke. Eleanor, she looked at him. I don't know how to thank you. His voice was rough, thick with emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. What you did in that courtroom, what you've done for my family, I can never repay it. You don't owe me anything, Caleb. I did what anyone would have done. No. He shook his head firmly. You did what you would have done, and that, as I have learned, is not the same thing at all. The carriage rolled through the gates and up the long drive. Mrs. Patterson was waiting on the porch, her face anxious until she saw the smiles, and then she pressed her hand to her heart and turned away to hide her tears. The girls woke as the carriage stopped, blinking in confusion until they realized they were home. Then Lucy scrambled down and ran toward the house, shouting for Mrs. Patterson, while Martha followed at a more dignified pace. Eleanor moved to follow them, but Caleb's hand on her arm stopped her. Wait. She turned back to find him looking at her with an expression she had never seen before, open, vulnerable, stripped of all the walls he had built around himself. I meant what I said, he told her quietly. I don't know how to thank you, but I know I want to try. I know I want... He stopped, searching for words. I know I don't want you to leave, ever. I know that these past weeks, watching you with my daughters, watching you fight for my family, I know it's changed something in me, something I thought was dead. Eleanor's heart was pounding. Caleb, I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I know it's too soon. I know there's still so much uncertainty, but I want you to know that whatever happens next, whatever you decide, you have a place here, at Highland Crest, with us. He paused. With me. The winter wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of snow and pine and the distant lowing of cattle. Above, the sky was clearing, the clouds breaking apart to reveal patches of pale blue. Eleanor looked at this man who had given her a chance when she had nothing, who had trusted her with his children, who had fought beside her against impossible odds. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the grief, the hunger, the endless walking, the 17 doors that had closed in her face before the 18th finally opened. She thought of Charlotte buried beneath the apple tree in Missouri, of Thomas lost to drink and despair, of all the dreams she had buried alongside them, and she thought of Martha and Lucy, asleep in the carriage with their arms around each other, of the future stretching out before them. Uncertain, yes, but bright with possibility. I'm not going anywhere, she said softly. This is my home now. You and the girls, you're my family, and I will stay as long as you'll have me. Caleb's face transformed. The tension, the fear, the carefully maintained distance, all of it fell away, leaving something raw and real and achingly hopeful. He did not kiss her. It was not the moment for that, not yet. But he took her hand in his, and they stood there together in the fading light, looking out at the ranch that had become their shared battleground and their shared sanctuary. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The war was over. The healing could finally begin. The weeks that followed the hearing brought a kind of peace that Highland Crest had not known in years. The threat of Helen Ashworth hung over them for a time, like storm clouds that refused to fully clear. But as December settled over the ranch and news trickled in from Cheyenne, those clouds began to dissipate. The district attorney had opened an investigation into her conduct during the custody case. Witnesses came forward, former servants, business associates, even Margaret herself, testifying to a pattern of manipulation and intimidation that stretched back decades. By Christmas, Helen Ashworth had retreated to Chicago in disgrace, her social standing crumbling, her influence evaporating like morning frost in sunlight. There would be no more threats, no more strangers at the gates, no more midnight fears about what the next day might bring. For the first time since Margaret left, Caleb Whitmore could breathe. Eleanor watched the change in him with a mixture of relief and wonder. The rigid tension that had defined him for so long began to soften, revealing glimpses of the man he must have been before grief and betrayal had hardened him. He laughed more easily now. He lingered at the dinner table after meals, listening to the girls chatter about their day. He came home from the fields earlier, seeking out their company rather than burying himself in work. And he looked at Eleanor in a way that made her heart race and her cheeks warm, even in the coldest weather. They did not speak of what had passed between them on the day of the hearing. There was no need. The words had been said, the feelings acknowledged. What remained was the slow, careful work of building something real, something that could withstand the weight of their histories and grow strong enough to carry their futures. It began with small things. A hand brushed against hers as they passed in the hallway. A cup of coffee left warming by the stove because he knew she would want it. The way he sought her eyes across the dinner table, as if confirming that she was still there, still real, still choosing to stay. The girls noticed, of course. Children always notice. "Are you going to marry Father?" Lucy asked one afternoon with the blunt directness that only a 5-year-old could manage. Eleanor nearly dropped the book she was holding. "What makes you ask that?" "Because he looks at you the way princes look at princesses in stories, and you look at him the same way." Lucy tilted her head, considering. "Also, Martha says you're in love, and Martha is almost never wrong about anything." Eleanor glanced across the library to where Martha was pretending to read, her cheeks flushed and her eyes very carefully not meeting Eleanor's. "I think," Eleanor said slowly, choosing her words with care, "that your father and I care about each other very much. But marriage is a big decision. It takes time." "How much time?" "I don't know yet, sweetheart. These things can't be rushed." Lucy nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. Then she returned to her own book, and the subject seemed to be closed. But that night, as Eleanor sat alone in the library watching the fire burn low, Caleb appeared in the doorway. "May I join you?" "Of course." He settled into the chair across from hers, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled. The wind whispered against the windows. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked steadily, marking the passage of time. "Lucy asked me something today," Caleb said finally. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "She asked if I was going to marry you." Eleanor felt her breath catch. "She asked me the same thing." "What did you tell her?" "That these things take time." Caleb nodded slowly. He was staring into the fire, his profile illuminated by the flickering light. "She's right, you know, the way I look at you. It's not something I planned or expected or even wanted at first. But it's there. It's been there for a long time." Eleanor's heart was pounding now, so loudly she was certain he must be able to hear it. "Caleb, I'm not asking you anything tonight," he said quickly. "I know it's too soon. I know you've been through enough upheaval without me adding more. But I want you to know, I need you to know, that when the time is right, when you're ready, I want to ask you properly. To be my wife. To be a mother to my daughters. To build a life together, here, on this land that means everything to me." He turned to look at her then, and his eyes were bright with something that might have been hope, or fear, or love. I just need to know if that's something you might want too. Someday. Eleanor rose from her chair and crossed to him. She knelt beside his seat, taking his hands in hers, feeling the roughness of his palms and the warmth of his skin. I walked for 3 weeks to get here, she said softly. I knocked on 18 doors before I found one that would open. I have spent my whole life searching for a place where I belonged, for people who would see me as I am and want me anyway. She looked up at him, and her eyes were wet with tears she did not try to hide. I found that here, with you, with your daughters. This is my home, Caleb. You are my home. And yes, someday, when the time is right, I would be honored to be your wife. He pulled her up into his arms then, holding her close against his chest, and Eleanor felt something inside her that had been broken for so long finally begin to heal. The grief was still there. It would always be there, a part of her like the color of her eyes or the sound of her voice. But it no longer defined her. It no longer held her prisoner. She had found something worth living for, something worth fighting for, something worth staying for. And she was never going to let it go. Winter deepened into January, bringing heavy snows that blanketed the ranch in white. The world grew smaller during those cold weeks, contracted to the warmth of the main house, the circle of firelight, the small universe of 5 people learning to be a family. Mrs. Patterson cooked enormous meals that steamed in the cold air. The girls had snowball fights in the yard and came inside with red cheeks and wet mittens, laughing in a way Eleanor had never heard before. Even Storm seemed calmer, as if the change in the household had somehow reached him too. Caleb spent hours in the barn with the wild stallion, not trying to break him or tame him, but simply being present, earning trust, inch by careful inch. He let me touch his nose today, Caleb reported one evening, his face alight with quiet triumph. Just for a moment before he pulled away, but it was something. That's wonderful, Eleanor said. What changed? Caleb considered the question. I stopped trying to make him into something he's not. I stopped seeing his wildness as a problem to be solved and started seeing it as part of who he is. Once I did that, he shrugged. It was like he knew, like he could finally trust that I wasn't going to hurt him. Eleanor smiled. Sounds like someone else I know. He looked at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. The girls? All 3 of you, actually. She reached across the table and took his hand. You've all been so hurt, so guarded, so afraid to let anyone in. But you're learning to trust again, all of you. And it's beautiful to watch. Caleb turned her hand over in his, tracing the lines of her palm with his thumb. You make it sound like I did something remarkable. All I did was stop running away. Sometimes that's the hardest thing in the world. February brought the first hints of thaw, and with them, an unexpected visitor. Eleanor was in the kitchen with Mrs. Patterson. When the sound of hoofbeats reached them, not the thundering approach of urgency, but the steady rhythm of a single rider taking their time, she went to the window and felt her breath catch in her throat. Margaret Whitmore sat on a rented horse at the edge of the yard, looking up at the house with an expression of profound uncertainty. She was thinner than she had been at the trial, her face pale and drawn, and she made no move to dismount. Eleanor dried her hands on her apron and went outside. For a long moment, the 2 women simply looked at each other. The wife who had left and the woman who had stayed, connected by the children they both loved and the man they had both, in different ways, tried to save. I shouldn't have come, Margaret said finally. Her voice was hoarse, as if she had not spoken in days. I promised I would stay away. You did. I know, She drew a shaky breath. I needed to see it. The house. The ranch. I needed to know they were happy. Eleanor considered her words carefully. They are happy. Happier than they've been in a long time. Margaret nodded, her eyes bright with tears she was trying not to shed. And you? Are you staying? I'm staying. Good. That's good. Margaret gathered her reins, preparing to leave. I won't come back. I needed to know. Margaret, wait. The other woman paused, her face a mask of controlled anguish. Eleanor walked closer until she was standing beside the horse, looking up at the woman who had caused so much pain and was clearly suffering so much herself. "The girls ask about you sometimes," she said quietly. "Not often, but sometimes. They're angry and hurt and confused, but they haven't forgotten you. They haven't stopped loving you, even though they wish they could." Margaret's composure cracked. A single tear slipped down her cheek. "I don't deserve their love." "Maybe not, but they give it anyway. That's what children do." Eleanor paused. "What they need to know, what they may be ready to hear someday when they're older, is that you didn't leave because of them, that your choices were about you, not about how much they were worth." "How do I tell them that?" "You don't. Not yet. But you could write to them. Short letters, once in a while, not trying to win them back, not asking for forgiveness, just letting them know you're thinking of them, that you remember their birthdays, that you're proud of who they're becoming." Eleanor met Margaret's eyes. "It won't fix what's broken, but it might help them heal." For a long moment, Margaret was silent. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, "for taking care of them, for being what I couldn't be. I'm not their mother, Margaret. I'm not trying to replace you." "I know. You're something else entirely." Margaret managed a watery smile. "You're exactly what they needed, what Caleb needed, what this whole family needed." She turned her horse and rode away without looking back. Eleanor watched until she disappeared over the hill, then returned to the house with a strange mix of emotions churning in her chest. She did not tell Caleb about the visit. Some things were better kept between women. March came in like a lion, as the saying went, with fierce winds and late snowstorms that kept everyone inside for days at a time. But beneath the lingering winter, Eleanor could feel the earth beginning to stir, the subtle promise of spring waiting just below the frozen surface. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Caleb asked Eleanor to walk with him to the barn. It was an unusual request. The weather was bitterly cold, and there was no obvious reason for the errand, but something in his voice made her reach for her coat without question. The barn was warm and quiet, filled with the soft sounds of horses settling in their stalls. Caleb led her past the rows of familiar animals until they reached the far end, where Storm stood in his reinforced enclosure. The stallion raised his head as they approached, his dark eyes wary but no longer wild with fear. He watched them with the alert stillness of a creature who had learned to wait and assess before reacting. "Watch," Caleb said quietly. He opened the stall door and stepped inside. Eleanor's heart jumped into her throat. She had seen what Storm could do, had heard the stories of broken bones and near misses. But Caleb moved slowly, steadily, his hands open and empty at his sides. Storm held his ground. His ears flickered back and forth, tracking Caleb's approach. But he did not rear, he did not kick, he did not try to bolt. When Caleb reached him, he raised one hand, palm up, and waited. The moment stretched out like taffy, elastic and endless. Then, with a soft breath that clouded in the cold air, Storm lowered his great head and pressed his nose into Caleb's palm. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. Caleb stood there for a long moment, stroking the horse's nose, murmuring words too soft for Eleanor to hear. Then he stepped back, left the stall, and closed the door behind him. "He's ready," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "After 3 years, he's finally ready to trust." "How did you do it?" "I didn't do anything. I just showed up. Every day, the same time, the same routine. I let him see that I wasn't going anywhere, that I would be patient for as long as it took." He turned to look at her. "Some things can't be forced, Eleanor. Some things have to grow in their own time." She understood. He was talking about more than the horse. "Are you saying I need to be more patient?" she asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I'm saying I don't want to wait anymore." His voice dropped, becoming low and serious. "I've been patient. I've given you time. But every day I wake up and see you in my house, with my daughters, building a life that feels more real than anything I've known in years. Every day I have to stop myself from asking you to make it permanent." Eleanor's heart was pounding. "Then stop stopping yourself." Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out something small that caught the lamplight. A ring, gold, simple, beautiful in its lack of pretension. "This was my grandmother's," he said. "She wore it for 53 years, through hardship and joy and everything in between. When she died, she left it to me with instructions to give it to the woman I loved. I've been carrying it in my pocket for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment." He took her hand and looked into her eyes. "Eleanor Brooks, I have loved you since the day you stood on my porch in rags and refused to beg. I have loved you through trials and battles and the slow, sacred work of becoming a family. I will love you for the rest of my life, however long that may be." He drew a breath. "Will you marry me?" Eleanor looked at the ring in his palm, at the hope and fear mingled in his eyes, at this man who had taken a chance on her when she had nothing and helped her become something more. "Yes," she said, and her voice was steady even as tears streamed down her face. "Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and the horses whickered softly in their stalls, and the wind howled outside, and none of it mattered because they were together, finally and completely together, and nothing would ever separate them again. The wedding took place on the first truly warm day of spring. They held it in the meadow behind the main house, where wildflowers were just beginning to push through the new grass, and the mountains rose in the distance like ancient witnesses. Mrs. Patterson had worked for weeks on the food, a feast fit for a celebration, she insisted, and would hear no argument about expense or modesty. The guests were few but dear. The ranch hands who had become family, old Pete, who gave Eleanor away since she had no father to do it, the minister from town who had known Caleb since childhood. Margaret did not come, but she sent a letter that arrived the morning of the wedding, wishing them happiness and promising to remember the date always. Martha and Lucy stood beside Eleanor as she said her vows, their faces shining with a joy that seemed to light them from within. When the minister pronounced Caleb and Eleanor husband and wife, Lucy threw her arms around Eleanor's waist, and Martha wiped tears from her eyes with the same fierce dignity she brought to everything. "You're really staying now," Martha said later, as they sat together at the wedding feast. "Forever." "I was always going to stay, sweetheart. The wedding doesn't change that." "I know, but it makes it official." Martha paused, then added quietly, "Can I call you mother? Not instead of my real mother, but because you're my mother too now, in a different way." Eleanor felt her heart crack open and heal in the same breath. "I would be honored." Lucy, sitting on her other side, tugged at her sleeve. "Can I call you Mama? Martha gets to say mother, so I want to say something different." "You can call me whatever you want, my love." "Good." Lucy settled against her side with a contented sigh. "I've been practicing. Mama Eleanor. It sounds nice." The celebration lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and toasts that grew increasingly emotional as the whiskey flowed. But eventually the guests departed, Mrs. Patterson shooed everyone out of the kitchen, and the Whitmore family, the new, complete, chosen Whitmore family, was left alone. Caleb carried Lucy upstairs when she fell asleep on the couch, her flower crown askew, and her cheeks flushed with happiness. Martha followed Eleanor to her old room, where they had laid out her things before the wedding, and hesitated at the door. "Thank you," she said suddenly. "For what?" "For not giving up. When I was horrible to you, when I tried to drive you away, when I made everything as difficult as I possibly could, you stayed anyway. You kept showing up." Her voice wavered. "No one ever did that before. Not for us." Eleanor drew the girl into her arms and held her tight. "I will always show up, Martha. Always. No matter what." They stood there for a long moment, mother and daughter bound not by blood but by something stronger, by choice, by commitment, by the slow accumulation of shared days and shared struggles and shared triumphs. When they finally pulled apart, Martha's eyes were dry but bright. "Good night, Mother." "Good night, sweetheart." Martha walked down the hall to her room, and Eleanor watched her go with a heart so full it ached. Then she turned and went to find her husband. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were droughts that threatened the cattle and blizzards that tested their endurance. There were moments of frustration and exhaustion and the ordinary friction that comes from any group of people living closely together. Storm never became fully tame, though he eventually allowed Caleb to ride him on special occasions, and Eleanor learned that some things remained wild no matter how much love you poured into them. But the challenges were balanced by joys that Eleanor had never dared to imagine during those long weeks of walking. She watched Martha grow from a wounded, wary child into a fierce young woman who inherited her father's love of the land and her mother's determination. She watched Lucy blossom from a frightened little girl into a gentle soul who collected injured animals and convinced everyone around her that the world was fundamentally good. She bore Caleb 2 more children, a son named Thomas, for the husband she had buried so many years ago, and a daughter named Charlotte, for the baby who had never gotten the chance to grow up. The house filled with noise and laughter, and the chaos of a family that kept expanding, kept changing, kept becoming something larger and more wonderful than any of them had anticipated. Highland Crest Ranch became known throughout the territory as a place of welcome and warmth. The school Eleanor established for the children of ranch workers grew into a proper institution, drawing families from miles around. The hospital wing she convinced Caleb to fund saved countless lives during the typhoid outbreak of 1892. The land they worked together flourished under careful stewardship, becoming a model for sustainable ranching that their neighbors eventually copied. But the achievement Eleanor was most proud of had nothing to do with buildings or institutions or agricultural innovations. It was the family they had built, the home they had created, the life they had chosen together. On the 10th anniversary of her arrival at Highland Crest, Eleanor walked out to the small cemetery on the hill behind the house. 2 graves waited there now, Mrs. Patterson, who had passed peacefully in her sleep the year before, and old Pete, who had lived to see his 92nd birthday before joining her. Eleanor stood before the simple headstones and thought about all the people who had helped her become who she was. Her mother, who had taught her to bake bread and never give up. Thomas, who had loved her imperfectly but genuinely. Charlotte, whose brief life had broken her heart and also eventually opened it. And the 18 doors. The 17 that had closed in her face and the one that had finally opened. "Thank you," she whispered, though she could not have said to whom. The dead, perhaps. Or the living. Or simply the universe, which had conspired in its mysterious way to bring a starving widow to the gates of a lonely ranch on an autumn afternoon 10 years ago. Footsteps approached behind her, and then Caleb was there, sliding his arm around her waist and pulling her close. "I thought I'd find you here. I was just thinking." "About what?" "About how much has changed, how much has stayed the same." She leaned into him, drawing warmth from his solid presence. "About how grateful I am that you opened that door." "I'm grateful you knocked." He kissed the top of her head. "The girls are asking for you. They want to start the celebration." Eleanor smiled. The entire family was gathered today, Martha and her new husband, a steady young rancher who looked at her like she hung the moon. Lucy and her beloved horses, which she trained now with a skill that rivaled any horseman in the territory. Thomas, gangly and 14, already showing his father's gift for leadership. Little Charlotte, who had her namesake's gray eyes and her own fierce spirit. They were all waiting. They were all hers. "Let's go home," she said. They walked back down the hill together, hand in hand, toward the house that had taken her in when she had nothing and given her everything. The woman who had once stood at those iron gates in torn clothes with nothing but hunger and determination had become the heart of a family, the builder of an institution, the proof that showing up every day, no matter how hard, could change everything. She had walked for 3 weeks to find this place. She would spend the rest of her life making sure it flourished. And when she finally closed her eyes for the last time, many years later, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who all carried pieces of her forward into the future, Eleanor Whitmore died knowing that she had been exactly where she belonged. The woman at the gates had come home,